25th August 1819. A boy named Alan Pinkerton entered a cramped Glasgow tenement where thin walls, factory smoke, and constant noise trained him to notice trouble before it reached his door. His father, William, served as a constable, walked beats through rough lanes, and carried home the marks and stories of a man who faced drinkers with knives and thieves with nothing to lose. When William died, wages stopped at once, and Alan left school for cooper shops where he shaved staves, bent them over steam, and hammered iron hoops while sawdust mixed with spilled ale under his boots. Glasgow pressed its laborers hard. Mills and foundries discolored the air. Landlords stacked families into damp rooms, and food prices rose faster than pay. Meetings for political reform drew crowds that wanted voting rights and legal protections that did not yet exist. Alan listened to speakers who attacked the old order and stood close enough to organizers that the police began to link his name with unrest. The risk of arrest grew each year he stayed, especially after he married Joan Carfrae and took on the burden of providing for a household. Staying meant living under suspicion. Leaving meant a dangerous voyage, but also the chance to work in a country where neither constables nor informers already knew his record. Alan and Joan sold what little they could not carry, booked steerage passages, and joined the crush of emigrants who lay in packed rows below decks on a vessel bound for North America. Ventilation was poor, meals were sparse, and rough weather rolled the ship hard enough to fling people from their bunks. Near Sable Island, the hull struck shoals and shuddered so violently that many believed it would break apart, but the crew shifted cargo, worked the pumps, and eased the ship into deeper water. The couple reached the New World shaken but alive and stepped into Detroit with the hope that a skilled cooper would find steady work. Detroit offered only intermittent wages. Cooper shops had more hands than contracts, and the town's growth did not match the influx of displaced workers. Alan moved from one short job to another and watched his savings thin while he and Joan shared lodging with other migrants. Word from farther west described Chicago as a rough but expanding city that needed barrels, crates, and casks in large numbers. Grain, timber, and livestock moved through its port and along its river, and the demand for containers increased every season. That prospect pulled the couple west again. Chicago gave Alan a place in a cooper shop attached to a brewery. The hours were long, but the pay kept food on the table while he studied the city around him. He walked its muddy streets, watched cargoes unloaded along the riverfront, and listened to merchants who discussed the need for barrels up the Fox River where new mills had started to grind grain and pack meat. Land near the city center already cost more than he could hope to pay. Land along the Fox still lay open to men willing to cut timber and raise their own buildings. Alan chose to leave the crowded riverfront, follow the Fox into the countryside, and set up independently. By 1843, he had built a small cabin near Dundee Township in Illinois and set his cooperage beside it. The riverbank provided stands of suitable trees, and nearby mills needed barrels for flour, pork, and whiskey. Alan felled timber, split logs, and shaped staves while his wagon served as transport and storefront on wheels. To keep the shop supplied, he poled a skiff along back channels and islands, always watching for straight-grained trees and noting any sign that did not fit the usual pattern of hunters, fishermen, or other woodcutters. One of those trips up the Fox changed his trade into something else. Approaching a low island he had passed often, he saw fresh cuts through brush along the shore and a narrow path pressed into the ground where none had existed earlier that year. Above the landing, several sets of boot prints marked the damp soil. When he moved inland under cover, he found a rough cabin that had not stood there before, with smoke leaking from a stone chimney and stacked firewood beside the door. The place showed signs of regular use but carried none of the noise or open activity of a hunting camp. Alan withdrew to watch from a distance over several days. A flat-bottomed boat came at irregular hours, always with men who spoke little and moved with care. One stayed near the landing with a pistol visible at his belt while the others carried sacks and kegs inside. They remained in the cabin for hours and left with smaller loads carried with unusual caution. When Alan later slipped closer to inspect the ground, he found metal shavings near a crude bench, pieces of alloy bearing blurred impressions, and a rejected coin blank tossed aside. The pattern of guarded landings, secretive work, and stamped metal pointed squarely to a counterfeiting operation. Reporting what he had found carried real danger. The men on the island were armed and had money at stake, and exposing them could bring retaliation. Alan judged that leaving them at work would poison trade through the whole valley, so he chose to involve the law. He rode to the county seat, requested an interview with the Kane County Sheriff, and gave a precise account of what he had seen, from the landing path and guard to the cabin, workbench, and scrap metal. The sheriff decided to act and asked Alan to guide a raid. On the agreed night, a small group of deputies and armed volunteers met on the riverbank. Wagon wheels were wrapped in cloth, lanterns were hooded, and conversation stayed low as Alan led them along the dark bank to the same shallow channel he had used alone. When a dull glow showed through the cracks of the cabin wall, the sheriff gave the signal. The party crossed the water, spread out, and rushed the door before the men inside could organize a defense. The counterfeiters tried to break free but met guns and clubbed rifles at every side. One suspect attempted to force a path toward the boat with a pistol in hand, slipped on the floor and had the weapon kicked away before he could fire. Another smashed at a window and froze when an armed deputy appeared outside the opening. The officers bound the men, emptied their pockets, and searched the cabin. They found presses, molds, files, stacks of unfinished coins, and letters that linked the island group to receivers in larger towns. The evidence removed any doubt. This was a working plant for fake currency that had already entered circulation. Newspapers in Illinois reported the raid and named the cooper whose observation had exposed the scheme. The notice brought Alan to the attention of law officers who had few trained investigators to call on. Within a short time, he received appointment as deputy sheriff in Kane County. His work shifted from barrel making to full-time enforcement. He now spent days in the saddle, riding rough roads between scattered farms, serving writs, and tracking suspects whose names appeared on warrants. Life as deputy meant long days in tough conditions. Alan rode in rain, snow, and heat, slept in spare rooms or on straw when weather kept him from returning home, and handled disputes that ranged from stolen livestock to assaults. He learned to read small signs on the ground, from the depth of hoof prints in thawing mud to the fresh cut of a fence rail lowered for a thief to move stock. In kitchens lit by lamplight, he took statements from frightened victims. In barnyards, he faced angry men who denied any wrongdoing while fresh tracks pointed straight to their doors. The work demanded control, because a deputy who lost his temper could ignite a fight that cost lives. Chicago's growth eventually pulled Alan back to the city. By the late 1840s, commercial traffic, population, and crime had all increased sharply. The city police had uniformed patrolmen and a chain of command, but no officer whose main duty was to link clues and follow criminals across ward lines. In 1849, Alan became Chicago's first full-time detective. He no longer walked a fixed beat. Instead, he went wherever robbery, fraud, or serious violence required work beyond an immediate arrest. One investigation at the old French cemetery on the lakeshore tested his skills and the public's trust. Families complained that graves had been disturbed, that earth had fallen oddly, and that some headstones no longer stood straight. Rumor said that body snatchers supplied cadavers to medical schools that wanted specimens for dissection. Alan inspected the cemetery during the day, memorized which graves seemed altered, and noted wagon tracks and footpaths near the fence. He then organized a night watch that varied its hours so intruders could not predict when officers might appear. On a cold night with wind off Lake Michigan, Allen and several officers saw a wagon approach with its lamps hooded. It stopped beside a row of recent burials. Men climbed down, unloaded shovels, and began to dig with speed that showed practice. They opened a grave, levered up the coffin lid, and reached inside. Allen ordered the move. The watch closed in from several sides and took the men into custody. The suspects turned out to be young men connected to medical instruction, not hardened highwaymen. But the crime of disturbing the dead ignited outrage across the city. The case showed Allen that citizens would demand protection not only from theft and assault, but also from acts that violated basic respect for the dead. Success in Chicago attracted federal attention. The United States Post Office Department faced repeated thefts from mail routes across the Midwest and wanted an investigator who could travel widely. Allen accepted appointment as a special agent and began tracing losses along routes in Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Michigan. He rode stages and steamers, used the new railroad lines whenever possible, and built charts showing where mailbags had last been seen intact. By comparing schedules, relay points, and crew assignments, he identified places where dishonest route agents or depot workers had time and privacy to open pouches and remove valuables. That work taught a clear lesson. Local sheriffs possessed authority only within their counties. A thief who stole in one county and sold stolen goods in another often escaped because officers did not share information quickly or at all. Allen concluded that crime moving along modern transport lines needed investigators who could follow it without regard to county or state borders. That conclusion led directly to his next step, the creation of a private agency that sold investigative work to clients who needed protection over wide areas. In 1850, Allen and Chicago attorney Edward Rucker formed the Northwestern Police Agency and opened an office on Washington Street. The firm offered to investigate thefts, frauds, and threats for railroads, banks, express companies, and large merchants. Allen imposed strict procedures from the first day. Operatives had to write detailed reports, record physical descriptions with as much precision as possible, transcribe key statements, and send everything back to the office where clerks filed the material for later use. Information became a tool and a product, not just a memory. When candidates came to the office to seek work, Allen looked for steadiness, a calm manner, and the ability to notice details without drawing attention. He hired former soldiers, ex-constables, and men who had handled security for railroads. In 1856, he interviewed Kate Warren, who argued that a woman could talk with wives, landladies, and fellow passengers in ways a strange man could not. Allen accepted her reasoning and hired her as a detective. She handled assignments that required entry into spaces where male operatives would have been turned away or watched closely. Railroads soon became the largest clients. Lines such as the Michigan Central, Michigan Southern and Northern Indiana, Illinois Central, Chicago and Galena Union, and Chicago Burlington and Quincy carried freight, passengers, and payrolls through stretches of country that had few deputies and many temptations. Theft from depots, safes, and moving trains cut into company profits and could damage confidence in rail travel if not checked. Railroad executives met with Allen and agreed that hiring his agency together would give them a coordinated protective force instead of scattered guards acting alone. On 1 February 1855, the agency and several major railroads signed a contract that made the Northwestern Police Agency responsible for policing their property across multiple states. The agreement granted detectives free transportation on trains so they could reach trouble spots quickly. It laid out pay, expense rules, and reporting requirements. Under that contract, operatives rode in baggage and express cars near safes, inspected yards and sidings for tampered switches or broken locks, and investigated wrecks that suggested sabotage rather than bad luck. Conditions for those operatives were physically rough and often dangerous. They rode in unheated cars in winter and worked long hours around hot stoves and oil lamps in summer. They sat in dim depots through the night, watching sidings and platforms for strangers who paid too much attention to safes or station offices. In some towns, corrupt local officers resented outside investigators who answered to distant clients rather than to county boards. Detectives who pressed inquiries into established theft rings sometimes faced threats or attacks from both criminals and their protectors. Despite those obstacles, the agency's method steadily improved its reach. Operatives gathered descriptions of suspects, noted scars, accents, clothing habits, and known companions, and sent that information to Chicago by telegraph and post. Clerks built case files and organized photographs so that when a name or face appeared again, even in another state, investigators could connect the person to earlier crimes. Messages sent ahead along the wires told station agents to watch for specific men stepping off particular trains. The network of reports turned scattered incidents into linked cases. By the end of 1860, Allen's agency had become a known presence along the rail corridors that linked the Midwest to the eastern seaboard. Trains now carried not only freight and mail, but also the leading politicians of a nation pulling towards civil conflict. Along the routes between Philadelphia, Harrisburg, and Baltimore, detectives already on railroad duty began to hear talk that spoke not of simple robbery but of organized violence aimed at a single passenger who would soon travel as President-elect of the United States. The Cooper, who had once scanned the Fox River for straight timber, now stood at the head of a private force whose next assignment would involve the safety of Abraham Lincoln, and through him, the future of the country. In February 1861, the rail lines into Baltimore carried uneasy traffic, with northern businessmen, southern sympathizers, and ordinary travelers sharing cramped cars while news of secession spread quickly by newspaper and word of mouth. Allen Pinkerton had been hired by railroad executives who feared that hostile men would wreck tracks or destroy bridges on the route that would soon carry President-elect Abraham Lincoln toward Washington. He established himself quietly in Baltimore under an assumed name, rented rooms that overlooked key streets, and began listening for signs that threatened not just property but the life of the incoming president. Baltimore sat in a border state with divided loyalties, harbor taverns and hotel parlors filled with talk that praised the newly formed Confederacy and cursed the Republican victory. Police officers, local politicians, and merchants weighed their options carefully, knowing that any open stand could ruin them if national power shifted. Pinkerton recognized that ordinary observation would not be enough. He needed agents who could move in circles that distrusted outsiders, who could learn planned actions that men shared only after the doors closed and the whiskey flowed. He brought several trusted operatives with him, among them Kate Warren and Timothy Webster. Warren adopted new names, new wardrobes, and new manners to fit into conversations among wives, sisters, and landladies tied to pro-Southern leaders. Webster posed as a businessman and sometimes as a courier, a man whose work gave him reason to know travel schedules, freight patterns, and gossip from other cities. They scattered through the city, meeting at odd hours to trade what each had heard, while Pinkerton sat at a rented desk each night and wrote detailed summaries that captured every phrase that pointed toward violence. Evidence built day by day. Warren cultivated regular visits to Barnum's Hotel, where a Corsican barber named Cipriano Ferrandini cut hair for men who supported the Southern cause. In private rooms off the main lobby, Ferrandini spoke of resistance, of the need to stop Lincoln from ever reaching the Capitol, and of volunteers who could be organized into groups ready to strike. One of Pinkerton's male operatives listened through thin walls as Ferrandini urged that a crowd could trap the president-elect during a carriage transfer in the city and use pistols and knives to finish him before guards could react. Webster worked a different angle. In parlors and back rooms, he made contact with men who belonged to the National Volunteers and to military drill clubs that had quietly formed inside the city. He heard of plans to sever telegraph lines and burn bridges north of Baltimore so that news of a successful attack would travel slowly while conspirators escaped. In one meeting, a contact described a scheme to surround Lincoln at the station where he would change trains, pressing a supportive crowd in close until a handful of armed men could fire at close range. The details varied from room to room, but each version rested on the same assumption, that Lincoln would pass through Baltimore openly, on a public schedule, with only ordinary escort. Pinkerton knew that time was short. Lincoln had already left Springfield on his long train journey, stopping at towns along the route to greet crowds. Threats along the rails combined with the specific stories emerging from Baltimore demanded a direct warning. Pinkerton traveled to Philadelphia and secured an interview with Lincoln in a room at the Continental Hotel on 21st February. The president-elect listened while the detective laid out names, meeting places, and tactics that had been gathered through weeks of undercover work. Lincoln at first resisted the idea of changing his plans to appear fearful, but the weight of detail from independent sources combined with the insistence of advisors persuaded him that ignoring the information could mean walking straight into an ambush. A new schedule formed in that room. Lincoln would complete his public obligations in Harrisburg, then break from the published route and return quietly to Philadelphia by a special train. From there, he would board a night train to Washington that would pass through Baltimore at hours when crowds were thin and city streets were mostly empty. Telegraph operators under sympathetic control would send routine messages but would be blocked from transmitting anything that identified the change in plans until the journey ended. Pinkerton and Warren would accompany Lincoln during the crucial overnight leg, each using their established covers to mask the significance of the small group moving through the stations. The plan moved into action on 22nd February. Lincoln spoke to the Pennsylvania legislature, then left Harrisburg earlier than expected. A special locomotive carried him and a small party back to Philadelphia, where he changed clothes for a less recognizable appearance and removed his tall hat that had already become a symbol in political cartoons. Warren prepared to pose as an invalid sister or caregiver, ready to explain away unusual arrangements in the sleeping car. Pinkerton moved among railroad officials to double-check schedules and ensure that no last-minute changes created fresh risks at the transfer points. Late that night, the small party boarded a Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore train with no banners, no band, and no crowd to greet them. Warren took her place as a watchful relative near the private compartment. Pinkerton remained alert in the passage and at the car door, scanning each station they passed. At Baltimore, the train reached the station where cars had to be pulled by horses across town to the next connection. Laborers completed the haul with only a handful of onlookers and night staff present. No organized mob formed, no gunmen pressed close. The party stayed inside, shades drawn. Cars were coupled to the next locomotive and the train resumed its run toward Washington. In the early light of 23rd February, Lincoln stepped quietly from the train in Washington hours before most citizens expected him. Only a few officials and friends greeted him at the station. Rumors of his altered route reached newspapers soon afterward. Some editors mocked the secrecy and claimed that he had entered the capital in disguise. Pinkerton endured the criticism and pointed instead to the simple fact that the man he had been hired to protect now stood alive in the city where he would take the oath of office. The work in Baltimore ended the immediate danger to Lincoln's journey and shifted Pinkerton's focus toward organized political intelligence. Within weeks, open war approached. By April, Confederate guns fired on Fort Sumter and the Union began mobilizing in earnest. Rail traffic carried troops, guns, and provisions to Washington and to forward camps. General George McClellan, who had known Pinkerton from earlier railroad business, recognized that the skills used to detect saboteurs and plotters on civilian lines could serve the Army. He arranged for Pinkerton to organize a secret service for the Department of the Ohio, then for the Army of the Potomac when McClellan took command there. In this military role, Pinkerton used the alias Major E.J. Allen to shield his family name and his agency from immediate attention. The new assignment demanded more than guarding any single person. Pinkerton had to build an intelligence service that could operate along hundreds of miles of front, from the defenses of Washington through Maryland and into Virginia. He recruited scouts and detectives from his existing agency and from trusted contacts, put them in plain clothes and scattered them among refugee streams, river crossings, and roads that led toward Confederate positions. Agents collected rumors, counted regiments in camp when they could see them, and questioned prisoners, deserters, and recently freed people who had moved through Southern territory. Each evening, Pinkerton's staff turned field notes into written reports that listed regiments, commanders, camp locations, supply status, and any mention of planned movements. Methods developed in this period included sketching fortifications from distant hilltops, measuring the time it took for columns to pass fixed points, and watching which railroad lines carried the heaviest traffic. Telegraphed summaries reached McClellan's headquarters with estimates that translated scattered observations into figures for total enemy strength. Pinkerton preferred conservative caution over aggressive risk. When evidence was incomplete, he favored higher numbers that would prevent his commander from underestimating Confederate forces. In the Manassas region, he reported that the enemy's strength stood in the range of 100,000 men, though post-war records showed that actual Confederate numbers there were significantly smaller. McClellan accepted Pinkerton's estimates and planned accordingly, choosing slow, methodical advances over sharp offensive blows. At the same time, Pinkerton's men carried out dangerous undercover missions directly in Confederate territory. One of the most effective early operatives was Timothy Webster, who had worked with the agency before the war and now posed as a Southern sympathizer. His work took him through Baltimore and into Virginia, where he gained the trust of Confederate officials and passed information back across the lines through couriers and coded letters. Webster reported on troop movements, fortifications near Richmond, and local conditions that mattered to Union planners. His life depended on maintaining his assumed loyalties in every word and gesture. Webster's network included Hattie Lawton, who posed as his wife on journeys to reduce suspicion, and John Scoble, an African-American operative who moved in roles that allowed access to servants' quarters and informal gatherings where white officers spoke more freely. Together, they created a flow of reports that described Confederate dispositions and attitudes. For a time, their movement between North and South went undetected. Then illness and betrayal altered the course of their work. During a mission in 1862, Webster fell badly sick in Richmond. His condition slowed him, kept him in lodging longer than planned, and drew unwanted attention. Local suspicion rose when couriers connected to his circle were arrested with compromised messages. Confederate authorities arrested Webster and Lawton, placed them in Richmond's Castle Thunder prison, and began a formal investigation of their activities. Pinkerton responded by sending messages to Washington that described Webster's service and urged intervention. President Lincoln warned the Confederate government through indirect channels that the execution of a Union spy could bring retaliation against Confederate agents held in northern prisons. The warning did not change the outcome. Webster faced a military court in Richmond, was convicted of espionage, and received a death sentence. On 29 April 1862, guards led him to a gallows at Camp Lee. The first attempt to hang him failed when the trapdoor jammed, prolonging his ordeal. When the mechanism was fixed and the drop finally came, witnesses heard him say that he suffered a double death. His body hung under armed guard as an example to others who might consider similar work. News of Webster's execution reached Pinkerton's headquarters and cut deeply into his agents. The man they had relied on for some of their best intelligence had died inside Richmond without uniform or public honor. Pinkerton ordered that Webster's reports and correspondence be preserved with special care and used his death as a warning in training sessions for new scouts. Undercover work against an organized army carried a risk that no careful planning could erase. If captured, a spy could expect prison at best, the gallows at worst. Other missions continued despite that loss. Pinkerton's operatives traced Confederate spy rings that operated in Washington, mapped safe houses in Maryland, and rode along rail lines that carried federal troops south. They inspected bridges, questioned suspicious laborers, and urged military commanders to station guards at key tunnels and junctions. Telegraph lines became another focus. During Lincoln's secret evening departure from Harrisburg to Philadelphia, Pinkerton had ordered the temporary cutting of certain lines to prevent hostile operators from spreading word of the change. During full war, the task changed to defending those wires from saboteurs who tried to bring down poles or tap messages. Every broken span of line meant delays, confusion, and the risk that an Army Corps would move without current instructions. The intelligence service produced large volumes of paper, each sheet carrying names, unit numbers, and locations. Clerks collated the data and drew charts that showed Confederate forces grouping around strong points like Yorktown and Richmond. The picture that emerged tended to overstate enemy strength because fragments from rumors, captured letters, and partial sightings all went into the totals. McClellan, already cautious by temperament, read the reports and became convinced that he faced armies much larger than his own. On the Peninsula Campaign, he advanced up the Virginia Peninsula with siege lines and entrenchments suited to an opponent of overwhelming size, while in reality Confederate defenders operated with fewer men stretched over wide ground. By the summer of 1862, criticism began to collect around both McClellan and his intelligence service. The failure to destroy the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, combined with the slow pace of operations, led senior officials in Washington to question whether the available information truly reflected conditions in the field. When McClellan's command authority waned after the Peninsula operations, Pinkerton resigned his military role and returned to his private agency. His Secret Service division for the Army of the Potomac closed, and other officers began to build new intelligence structures within the Army itself. The Civil War years left lasting marks on the men who had served under Pinkerton's direction. Some returned to railroad and industrial work carrying memories of nights spent near enemy lines and of comrades lost to prison or execution. Others stayed on in government service, applying lessons learned from Confederate spies and saboteurs to new problems involving counterfeiting and internal security. For Pinkerton, the period from the Baltimore investigation through the Peninsula Campaign proved that private detectives could play a central role in national defense, but it also exposed the limits of private judgment when estimating military strength in a conflict that ran on a scale larger than anything he had faced on peacetime railroads. May 1866 to July 10, 1868. In the years just after the Civil War, the Adams Express Company moved government bonds, bank drafts, and hard coin on almost every important rail line in the North. At its Chicago and New York offices, clerks watched growing stacks of paper that stood for fortunes. The company's managers knew that local sheriffs along those routes worked alone, answered to county politics, and had no reach once a train crossed a state line. For serious thefts, Adams turned to one private outfit in particular, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, whose founder had already crushed a notorious embezzlement inside the company and recovered almost all of a $50,000 haul from the Montgomery, Alabama office. That earlier express case and a later burglary of an unattended Adams car between New York and Boston convinced Adams executives that whenever large sums moved by rail, Pinkerton operatives had to be on call. Far to the west, in southern Indiana, a very different group watched those same express cars. Around Seymour and the nearby hamlet of Rockford, the Reno brothers had built a loose network of arsonists, horse thieves, counterfeiters, and bounty jumpers. Their base of operations centered on the Raider House, a rough hotel near the tracks where railroad men, drifters, and local hard cases drank through the night. Newspapers in Jackson County warned travelers that thieves and killers infested the town. Early 1866 brought a string of crimes that showed how little fear the gang had of county law. A guest of the Raider House turned up dead in the White River, his head cut off. The Cortland post office was robbed. Citizens whispered that the Renos had a hand in almost every crime, but few dared to testify. And the sheriff's deputies had little appetite for challenging a family that moved through the county in armed groups. When the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad's eastbound passenger train pulled away from the Seymour Depot on the evening of October 6, 1866, the Renos put a new crime into motion. 3 of their men boarded like ordinary passengers and waited until the coaches had rolled a few miles into the countryside. The train carried an Adams Express car, a wooden box on wheels where Messenger Elam Miller guarded company safes. The gang forced their way into the car, leveled pistols at Miller, and demanded the keys. He opened the small local safe that held packages picked up along the route. The robbers scooped out bags of gold coins and paper notes, then turned to a second, much larger through safe bolted to the floor. Miller told them he did not have the combination. One of the outlaws struck him hard across the head, and they shoved the heavy chest across the floor, wrestled it to the side door, and kicked at the bell cord. The engineer up ahead felt the tug on the signal rope and eased his throttle, thinking a brakeman had called for a routine stop. As the train slowed, the bandits forced the Adams car door open and heaved the big safe out into the darkness. Then they jumped down themselves and shouted for the engineer to pull ahead. Behind them, the Ohio and Mississippi coaches rattled away toward Cincinnati, passengers unaware that armed men had just stripped an express car and dropped a safe along the right-of-way. In the brush near the tracks, horses waited with Frank and William Reno and several other gang members holding the reins. They tried to crack the safe with tools brought from a nearby farm, but the thick iron refused to give. Within an hour, a railroad route agent brought back men on handcars. Seeing lights bobbing along the line, the gang abandoned the safe and melted into the woods with the gold and notes from the smaller box. The job stunned the railroad world because it turned a moving train into the scene of the crime. Adams Express discovered from court records that the robbers had carried away tens of thousands in gold coin and banknotes. Within hours, company officers in Cincinnati and Chicago were trading telegrams with Pinkerton headquarters. Unknown to the Renos, Adams had already put all large express losses under Pinkerton protection after the earlier thefts. Alan Pinkerton read the wires in Chicago and ordered operatives onto southbound trains with instructions to pose as gamblers, drummers, and railroad hands in the saloons and hotels near the Seymour Depot. In one Seymour tavern, an undercover agent took a bar job, serving drinks to men who boasted that nothing happened in Jackson County without the Renos knowing it. The detectives worked quietly, pulling on every thread. A passenger named George Kinney came forward to Ohio and Mississippi officials and said he had watched the robbery unfold from his coach window. He described 2 of the men closely enough that Pinkerton operatives matched them to John and Simeon Reno, who had already drawn attention for other crimes. Local officers, now prodded by Adams Express and backed by Pinkerton investigators, arrested John and Sim Reno and an associate, Frank Sparks, on state robbery charges. For the first time, the gang leaders sat behind bars facing a case that did not rely on frightened local victims but on a corporate client willing to pay detectives and attorneys. On October 11th, however, the prisoners posted bail through home county contacts and walked out into the street while kin and sympathizers watched from nearby doorways. The witness who had stood up now became the gang's next target. Late one night, someone pounded on the door of Kinney's house in Seymour. When he stepped outside with a lamp, he was cut down by gunfire. With the one man who could identify the robbers lying dead in the yard, other passengers refused to give statements. Pinkerton agents who had worked on the case could not make a prosecutor compel terrified townspeople to testify. The state dropped the charges for the Renos. That outcome proved that local law could be bent or broken if witnesses vanished. For Adams Express and the Pinkertons, it showed that corporate clients could not rely on county juries alone to protect their rolling safes. The murder of Kinney did not stand alone. Jackson County's newspapers carried reports of more killings and robberies through late 1866. On December 29th, a woman named Marion Cutler, who lived alone near Clear Spring, was robbed, raped, and murdered. 3 men unaffiliated with the Reno brothers went to the jail at Brownstown awaiting trial for that crime. Citizens had watched suspects go free too many times. On March 30th, 1867, hundreds of masked men rode into Brownstown in formation, battered down the jail door with sledgehammers, dragged the Cutler killers out, and hanged them from a tree on the courthouse lawn. The Jackson County Vigilance Committee, also called the Scarlet Mask Society, had arrived. Their warning ran in local papers that lynch law would answer crimes if courts failed. Alan Pinkerton followed those reports closely from Chicago. His agency now had a written agreement with Adams Express to take major express cases, and the unresolved Seymour robbery still bothered him. He knew the Renos moved in and out of Jackson County with little fear. When word reached him in late 1867 that a county courthouse in Gallatin, Missouri had been robbed and that witnesses named John Reno as one of the raiders, he saw another opening. The Daviess County Treasurer's safe had been broken open on November 17th, and bond certificates as well as cash had vanished. With state authorities overwhelmed, the county turned to Adams Express, which called in its detectives. Pinkerton operatives traced John Reno's movements back toward Indiana. They learned that he still used the Seymour rail station as a hub. In early December, when he stepped off a train near home, detectives and officers seized him on the platform and hustled him onto another car before any of his friends could gather. Within weeks, he stood in a Gallatin courtroom surrounded by armed guards while a lynch-minded crowd milled in the street outside. When he pleaded guilty in January 1868, a judge sentenced him to 25 years in the Missouri State Penitentiary. One of the original brains of the gang rode east in chains, and Pinkerton sent Adams Express a report explaining that the man who had mocked the law after the Seymour robbery was now locked behind solid stone walls. The removal of John did not end the gang's career. Frank Reno stepped into full command and began pushing the group farther from home to avoid the new vigilantes. In February 1868, they crossed into Iowa and went after county treasuries instead of trains. One job in Harrison County stripped the office in Magnolia of cash. Another in Mills County emptied a safe of thousands in local funds. A third, raid in Howard County, took more money in late March. These were not rough stick-ups in taverns, but organized entries into official buildings, carried out at night by men who took their time working on heavy locks and carrying out ledgers along with currency. Adams Express did not lose money in those Iowa jobs, but the pattern showed that the Reno gang still felt no fear of local law. County sheriffs in sparsely settled areas had almost no staff. They could send wires, but they could not follow robbers across state lines. For Pinkerton, the string of Iowa robberies raised another concern. If the gang kept operating with impunity, it would invite imitators who would go after express cars again. To shut that down, he authorized his son William, now a senior operative, to lead a larger team into western Iowa. Working with local informants around Council Bluffs, William Pinkerton traced some of the gang to the home of a former outlaw, Michael Rogers. The detectives hit the house hard. They forced the door, disarmed the men inside, and searched the rooms. In a stove, they found packets of partially burned paper that turned out to be county warrants and notes taken in the robberies. The raid netted Frank Reno, Rogers, Albert Perkins, and Miles Ogle. The prisoners went to the county jail while Pinkerton wrote triumphant telegrams to Chicago. In the cells, the gang bided their time. On April 1st, they broke a hole through a jail wall, squeezed out into the yard, and dropped mocking April Fool messages in chalk for the guards to read. By the time anyone outside realized what had happened, the Outlaws were over the state line and slipping back toward Indiana. Their next move would pull Adams Express directly into the center of the story again. On the night of May 22, 1868, a Jeffersonville, Madison, and Indianapolis Railroad train left Jeffersonville for the run north. The line cut through dense woods and swampy ground near a refueling point called Marshfield, south of Seymour. Close to 11 o'clock, the engineer and fireman stopped to take on wood and water. In the dark beyond the platform, a line of armed men stepped out and seized the locomotive crew. They uncoupled the engine and the Adams Express car from the rest of the train, then forced the engineer to open the throttle and drive the reduced consist north away from the passenger coaches. Inside the express car, Messenger Thomas Harkins held his ground as the door splintered under blows. He fired a revolver at the first man through, but the gang overpowered him in the crowded car. They beat him with pistol butts and iron bars until he lay bleeding, then threw him out onto the embankment as the train clattered through the woods. Alone in the express car with their tools, the robbers worked over the Adams safes. They had time now. The uncoupled engine dragged only a single car, and the passenger coaches sat miles to the south with no locomotive and no telegraph key, within reach. When the gang finally halted the train near the Muscatatuck River bottoms, other riders waited with horses. The robbers pried open the Adams safes and pulled out government bonds, currency, and coin worth $96,000 according to company figures. By morning, farmers found Harkins barely alive in the weeds beside the tracks. Doctors could do little for his crushed skull. Newspapers in Louisville, Cincinnati, New York, and Chicago printed outraged stories describing masked men who had stopped a train on open track, savaged an express messenger, and escaped with a fortune. The robbery hit every pressure point for Adams and the railroads. Passengers only learned what happened when the stranded coaches were pushed north hours later. The public asked why the company had not protected its cars better. Adams turned again to Pinkerton, and this time both organizations understood that nothing short of breaking the Reno gang apart would restore confidence. Pinkerton detectives began tracing the movements of known gang associates from Seymour and Rockford. Some of the men vanished almost at once. Frank Reno, Charlie Anderson, Albert Perkins, and Miles Ogle headed east and crossed into Canada, settling near Windsor across the Detroit River where American warrants had no automatic force. Simeon and William Reno, who preferred city gambling houses, drifted into Indianapolis and spent money freely. Back in Indiana, Pinkerton agents and Jackson County vigilantes moved over the same ground from different directions. The detectives gathered names, watched rail depots, and pressed informants. The vigilantes rode country roads at night, looking for any trace of the men who had brought national shame on their county. In early July, new intelligence reached Pinkerton field men that a group of Reno associates planned another train job on the Ohio and Mississippi line. This time the target was an express car near Brownstown, the same rough corner of the county where the earlier crimes had played out. Pinkerton coordinated with railroad officials to put a team of armed agents aboard the train without fanfare. In the early hours of July 10th, as the train rolled east, engineer James Flanders made an unscheduled stop at Brownstown as part of the robbers' plan. Some of the gang boarded there, expecting a routine crew change. A friendly engineer, John Moore, was supposed to take the throttle and later uncouple the express car. What the robbers did not know was that Flanders had already warned his superiors. 10 Pinkerton men waited inside and around the Adams car with rifles and heavy revolvers. When Moore stopped the train again in the countryside and the gang forced the express car door, they stepped into a close-range gunfight instead of a cowering messenger. Bullets tore through the thin car walls. Several robbers staggered back wounded, and the survivors scrambled off the train to reach horses waiting down the line. One man, Volney, Elliot, could not keep up. Badly hurt, he was captured and taken to the jail at Seymour. Elliot understood what awaited him if he stayed silent. The Jackson County Vigilance Committee had already hanged other prisoners from courthouse trees. The detectives offered him one way out. In exchange for a full list of names and plans, he could hope for a formal sentence instead of a rope. Elliot talked, giving Pinkerton agents details on the Brownstown crew and on men tied to the Marshfield robbery. Using that information, officers arrested Theodore Clifton and Charlie Roseberry near Rockford and crowded them into the same jail. By late July, 6 members of the broader gang had been taken alive through detective work that reached across state lines and into distant towns. Local citizens had no intention of seeing another court case collapse. On the night, a train carried Clifton, Roseberry, and Elliot toward the Brownstown jail. A masked column stopped it near a crossing a few miles west of Seymour. Armed men swarmed the express car where the prisoners rode under guard, disarmed the escort, and marched the 3 shackled outlaws to a beech tree near the tracks. Ropes went over a sturdy limb. Without any judge present, the vigilantes hanged all 3 men until they stopped moving. The spot soon became known as Hangman Crossing. When Moore captured, Reno associates were moved by wagon instead of train to avoid a repeat attack. The vigilantes intercepted that convoy as well and used the same tree. By the time those July lynchings ended, 6 suspected train robbers dangled from its branches. For Adams Express executives reading Pinkerton's reports, the picture was harsh but clear. Local sheriffs could be outgunned, judges could be intimidated, and witnesses could be killed. Yet methodical detective work still exposed the men who had turned trains into moving targets. The Reno gang had slipped away from county law for years, but once Adams placed a standing contract in Pinkerton's hands, their world narrowed. Some of the core brothers were still alive and abroad, and the agency would follow them into other jurisdictions, even into Canada. In southern Indiana, though, the great lesson had already been stamped into memory by the bodies at Hangman Crossing. Train robbers could dodge local lawmen for a time, but once express companies called in private detectives with reach beyond a single county, the odds turned sharply against them. October 21st, 1871, the northbound Mobile and Ohio train rolled into Union City, Tennessee, and for a few unguarded minutes the most valuable car in the consist sat almost alone in the dim yard. The passengers had gone in to eat. The engineer, fireman, conductor, brakeman, and regular express messenger were in the station dining room. Only the extra guard, a young man named George Thompson, stayed in the express car with a tray of food in his hands, a safe full of currency behind him, and a sliding door left a hand's breadth open to the warm night air. A porter from the station stepped up with Thompson's supper and passed the tray inside. As the porter turned away, he saw 2 men spring silently into the half-open doorway. Almost at once, the train began to move backward onto a side track, pushed by an unseen hand on the throttle at the locomotive. By the time the porter reached the depot to give the alarm, the express car had already slipped beyond the lantern light. Inside the car, Thompson heard the change in the wheels and felt the movement. When he turned, one man had a revolver close to his face while another clamped a hand around his throat. He surrendered the safe key at once. The intruders emptied the drawers and packages in quick silence, then ordered that Thompson's small roll of personal money be handed back. They wanted company funds, not a guard's wages. A lantern signal brought the backing to a stop. The two men jumped down and vanished into the trees, leaving Thompson shaking beside an open safe. There were no shots and no bodies when the crew finally reached the car on foot. Only a forced safe, an unharmed but humiliated guard, and missing currency told the story. The thieves had taken about $6,000. Worse still, the southbound train due through that same junction carried a far larger shipment. If the robbers had reached that car instead, they could have seized a fortune. The Mobile and Ohio management telegraphed their General Superintendent M.J. O'Brien, and he in turn sent word to Chicago, to the man express companies now treated as their first resort when rail and frontier policing failed, Alan Pinkerton. When Pinkerton read the telegram in his Chicago office several days later, the case did not look large by the simple measure of money lost. What alarmed him was the method and the timing. Just 3 months earlier, an express messenger on the same Mobile and Ohio line had been overpowered near Moscow, Kentucky, and his safe stripped of funds. 2 of Pinkerton's operatives had been sent there at once, but the robbers had disappeared into the swamps and backwaters along the Mississippi. That first haul had been fairly small, and the company had decided that the cost of a long manhunt did not balance the loss. Extra guards had been placed in the cars as a cheaper answer. Now the gang had struck again, using the same technique in a region where the land and the people both helped them. The southwestern corner of Kentucky and the adjoining part of Tennessee formed one of the most difficult hunting grounds the agency had yet faced. The country lay low near the great rivers. Annual floods from the Ohio and Mississippi left wide belts of water in their wake. When the rivers dropped, they left crooked bays, sunken ponds, and long strips of cane that grew in dense stands taller than a man on horseback. In wet seasons, a skiff could be pushed among the cane tops. In dry months, a person on foot could walk for hours along narrow paths under the stalks and hear people nearby without seeing them. The rail line ran on slightly higher ground near the edge of this region, so a gang that knew the country could reach the right spot, strike a train, and disappear into the wet woods without leaving a trail that any outsider could follow. The population out in those low stretches also complicated an investigation. Border counties around towns such as Union City and Hickman held merchants, planters, and professionals who wanted crime suppressed and would cooperate with detectives. Deeper in the swamp belts lived small farmers, woodcutters, hunters, and men who raised stock among the cane. Many carried old injuries from war service or guerrilla fighting. Most were armed from habit. They knew how to move quietly through the woods, how to shoot accurately, and how to read faint traces on the ground. Some would help detectives and sheriffs. Others quietly traded with thieves, sheltered them, or kept silent out of fear. For an express company, the fact that a sheriff's office existed on paper nearby did not mean that its property would be protected in practice. The Moscow robbery had already shown Pinkerton that the company needed more than extra guards in that region. In July, 3 men had boarded the car near Moscow, forced the messenger at gunpoint to open his safe, and then vanished into the swamps. Pinkerton's first team had traced them as far as the river country, then watched the trail dissolve in water and cane. The amount stolen had not justified keeping a large force in the field for months, so those men had been recalled. The second robbery forced a different calculation. Express business had grown sharply in the years since the Civil War. The new transcontinental line joined the older eastern trunk roads to the Pacific. Cargoes of currency, bonds, and gold now moved from Atlantic ports through Chicago and St. Louis, then south through hubs such as Memphis. From there, some ran down the Mississippi toward New Orleans, and some moved inland on lines like the Mobile in Ohio. Men who could stop a single car at a remote junction threatened a network far larger than the short stretch of track under their feet. Pinkerton decided that this time the gang had to be run down completely. Partial success would mean nothing once word spread that 2 train robberies had been carried out with little risk. He sent his eldest son, William A. Pinkerton, to take charge on the ground. William had grown up in the work, starting as a messenger and runner in the Chicago office and moving into field command during the war. By the early 1870s, he had directed large operations of his own. For this case, he took only a small staff, planning to add trusted local men and express company operatives as needed. The first task was to reach Union City, listen to everyone who had seen or heard anything around the train that night, and begin separating solid clues from rumor. By the time William arrived in Union City, a week had passed since the express car rolled backward out of the yard with only George Thompson inside. Thompson and the porter repeated their accounts. Thompson admitted that he had broken company rules by letting the messenger, Martin Crowley, hand over the safe key and leave him with both the key and the paperwork while Crowley went to supper. 2 or 3 other witnesses remembered seeing unknown men near the train that evening, but their descriptions varied. Some recalled 2 figures heading toward the locomotive before the train backed onto the siding. Others were unsure. William heard every one of these people out, wrote down their observations, and compared them in the small hotel room that served as his headquarters. Within 3 days, he was convinced that the robbers had numbered at least 4 men, with 2 in the express car and at least 1 at the locomotive. He also recognized a pattern from the Moscow affair. In both robberies, the men had boarded in a casual way just as the train paused near a small community. They had taken advantage of a relaxed moment when the crew stepped away. They had worked without needless talk or cruelty. In each case, one robber had checked the other from stealing the guard's personal money. The men were ruthless toward companies but wanted to appear more than common thugs. This was the way professional bandits operated, who hoped to win a reputation and sympathy among local people. William had no doubt that the second robbery had been committed by the same core group who had struck at Moscow. The problem was to find them in a country where small settlements lay miles apart and the spaces between were filled with difficult ground and suspicious people. The express company officials in Memphis and Union City were eager to see quick arrests, but their eagerness created its own problems. Every few days, someone sent in word of a suspicious stranger. A rumor about a man who had spoken carelessly in a saloon, or a claim by a would-be amateur detective who insisted that he could solve the case for a price. William checked each lead because any one of them might hold a genuine fact, but he did not allow company officers or local enthusiasts to dictate his movements. In his view, a detective operation needed a single plan and a clear boundary between those who gathered information and those who made decisions. As he sifted through these early reports, one name kept resurfacing. A low riverside store at a place called Lester's Landing, several miles down the Mississippi from Hickman, had become the favored meeting spot of rough men who came and went without visible means of support. The store had been opened recently by 3 partners. They called themselves J. H. Clark, Ed Russell, and William Barton. Locals said the store could not be supported by the trade of a scattered canebrake population, yet the men seemed to have money. They were known to be good shots and to be constantly armed. They had mentioned work in distant cities along the river and on northern railroads, but had given no clear account of their past. Their bearing and speech marked them as outsiders. William weighed that information against the fragments he had collected at Union City. The 5 men seen around a campfire near the track the night before the robbery matched the outline of the trio at Lester's Landing plus associates. Hicks, an old planter who had been drinking heavily on his way home that night, remembered the men around that camp. Their clothes had been better than those of ordinary laborers. Their speech hinted at northern towns. One man had mentioned Fayette County, Illinois, and a river there along a route known for earlier theft cases. Another had spoken of wanting at least $10,000. Hicks had also seen large revolvers at their belts. Taken together, these details pointed toward organized express robbers rather than chance drunks camping by the rails. To test that judgment, William decided to inspect Lester's Landing in person. On the last day of October, he rode out from Union City with one of the express company's detectives, Patrick Connell, and a local man named Bledsoe who knew the river country. They followed poor tracks through timber and across low ground until they reached the edge of the Mississippi bottom. There they stopped at the house of a planter named Merrick, who confirmed what William had already heard. The store at the landing sold little besides whiskey. Its owners were strangers who kept to themselves, carried plenty of money, and had drawn to their counter a crowd of Kane countrymen more dangerous than their usual neighbors. Merrick's account strengthened William's view that these were the express robbers. From Merrick's farm, a rough trace led through patches of cane over damp soil and down toward the river. By late afternoon, the horses picked their way out of close growth into a clearing. The river lay a short distance away, its muddy surface lower than the ground on which a log house and barn had been built. A small wood yard and landing stood closer to the water. Up on the higher ground, the store itself sat near the path that climbed from the landing. The structure was a simple board shack with one door and one window. Behind it stood a rail fence and a cornfield. The cornstalks had been left standing tall and dry, forming a screen near the back of the house. Beyond that lay the cane again, thick even this late in the season. William and Connell dismounted at the fence and left Bledsoe and a young man named Gordon to hold the horses. The store door was locked and no one answered when they called out. The house beyond showed no smoke at the chimney, but William knew that in such places men could sit quietly inside and watch strangers approach. He sent Connell around toward the rear entrance while he walked up to the front door of the dwelling, pushed it open, and stepped into a central hall. On one side, a room opened off that hall. As William moved toward it, he heard voices within. He and Connell entered from opposite doors at the same moment and found themselves facing 5 armed men, a woman, and a girl. The men rose from benches and chairs and demanded to know who the visitors were and what they wanted. At that instant, William understood that he had brought only one partner into close quarters. With a group who might be the very band he had been sent to hunt, retreat would provoke suspicion and might trigger gunfire. An open attempt at arrest would almost certainly bring on a fight in which he and Connell would be badly outnumbered. He kept his tone even and said that they were travelers who had lost their way and wanted to know how to reach a nearby settlement before nightfall. The men watched the 2 strangers closely. Their clothes were cleaner than those of most Kane country farmers. Their pistols were heavy and well kept. The room smelled of tobacco smoke, liquor, and wood smoke. Rifles stood in one corner. On the rough table lay playing cards and a bottle. None of the men relaxed as William spoke. He asked a few questions about roads and settlements. The answers were short and suspicious. Every movement in the room told him that the men were on edge and ready to reach for their weapons if they sensed any threat. William noted faces, heights, and voices, all the small identifying marks he might need later when they were no longer on their own ground. Then he thanked them, stepped back into the hallway, and left the house with Connell walking a pace behind him. Back at the fence, he swung into the saddle as if an uncertain traveler still trying to make daylight. Only once the party had ridden out of sight up the trail did William tell Bledsoe and Gordon what they had seen. He was satisfied that the 3 men running the store formed the nucleus of the gang. The next move would not be a casual visit. It would be a planned strike with enough force to overcome hardened robbers who knew the ground and would fight hard to avoid prison. That kind of operation could not be launched overnight. He needed warrants, coordination with sheriffs on both sides of the river, and additional detectives drawn quietly from other districts. While these arrangements went forward, the gang at Lester's Landing did not sit idle. William's agents watched movements as best they could without provoking a direct clash before the net tightened. They traced visits to relatives and associates upriver and inland. Through this work, the name Farrington emerged. The mother of several of the suspects lived in the district, and her talk made plain that she admired her son's daring and believed they would never allow themselves to be taken. As the case widened, it became clear that the gang who had struck the express cars had committed other crimes in the region, including killings that had gone unpunished in the loose climate of post-war river country. When the time came to close in, the search shifted into Missouri as some of the robbers tried to move away from the original scene of their crimes. Pinkerton men, express company detectives, and local posses tracked them across rough ground and small settlements. In one confrontation, the detectives and their allies surrounded a cabin where several members of the gang had holed up. The building stood away from other houses with cover around it that made a rush dangerous. After a tense exchange, the cabin caught fire during the standoff. With flames climbing the walls and smoke filling the single room, the men inside finally chose surrender over burning alive or being shot as they tried to run. The capture at the burning cabin did not end the work. One man's confession filled in the details of both train robberies and tied them to lesser crimes on back roads and river landings. Another suspect was taken in a separate encounter. A remaining gang member was traced to the transfer boat Illinois, which carried rail cars and passengers across a river. When detectives moved in to arrest him on the deck, he fought with desperate strength. The struggle ended with him going into the water and not coming up again. Local witnesses remembered that scene in particular because one of the feared express robbers died in the river instead of walking away to boast in saloons. With the core band crushed, attention turned back to Union City. The men still in custody faced formal charges in connection with the October robbery. Feelings in the town ran high. People who had once doubted that organized thieves were at work in their region now knew that a practiced gang had used their own backcountry as a refuge. Some citizens felt that regular legal process was too slow or too uncertain to deal with men who had already shown that they could move across state lines and melt into the cane brakes when it suited them. A vigilante temper rose. In the end, several of the captured gang members died at the hands of local citizens rather than under a court sentence. Their bodies hanging in public places were meant to tell every thief in the river country that the community would not accept further attacks on the express lines. For the Southern Express Company and for the railroads that carried its safes, the lesson ran deeper than the fate of a single gang. The Moscow and Union City robberies had proven that a small, disciplined group could stop a train, overpower an express car, and escape through rough country faster than regular officers could react. The Pinkerton operation showed that a small, disciplined detective force, directed from a central office and willing to work patiently, could answer that threat even in ground that favored the criminals. After those cases, express firms expanded their use of private detectives along key routes, and railroad managers grew more willing to hire special agents dedicated full-time to the protection of rolling stock and freight. By 1873, railroad and express cases like these had turned the agency into a mobile professional force aimed directly at serious interstate crime. Sheriffs and marshals still answered for daily order in towns and counties. Rangers, militias, and army detachments still handled open fighting with raiders and guerrillas. But whenever men used the railroads to commit planned robberies, it was increasingly the Pinkertons who were called. Their pursuit of the Mississippi Outlaws bridged the period between the first organized train robbers in the years after the war and the better-known bands who would strike farther west in the next decade. The burned cabin, the vigilante ropes in Union City, and the drowned robber off the side of the Illinois showed what it cost to challenge detectives who now treated the rails and express cars from the Mississippi Valley to the new transcontinental line as one connected front. 31st January 1874. Cold air lay over the little station hamlet of Gadd's Hill in Wayne County, Missouri, where a short platform, A combined store and post office, and a few houses stood beside the St. Louis Iron Mountain and Southern Line. That afternoon, 5 mounted men rode in, their faces covered and their revolvers easy in their hands. They took the store, pushed the handful of townspeople inside at gunpoint, and waited while the southbound Iron Mountain train ran late along the wooded grades. When the headlight finally appeared down the line, a bonfire on the track and a red flag brought the locomotive to a sharp stop. The masked riders stepped out of the trees, seized the crew, and walked through the coaches with practiced control, separating frightened passengers from their valuables, while other men went straight to the Adams Express safe in the baggage car. The gang had already learned from earlier raids how to pose as avengers instead of simple thieves. They spared women and men whose hands showed the thickened skin of manual work, taking jewelry and wallets only from those they judged prosperous. In the baggage car, they broke open the express safe that held company funds, stuffing currency and papers into grain sacks. On the platform, a few townsmen watched from the store windows while the outlaws finished, mounted, and rode north toward rougher hills before any organized posse could form. Within days, newspapers named the James Younger gang as the authors of what they called the first train robbery in Missouri, and accounts repeated that Jesse James himself had left a written notice with the engineer, so that reporters would print the incident exactly as the outlaws wanted it told. Inside the Adams Express offices in St. Louis and Chicago, the robbery looked different. Ledger entries showed that a southbound train on a regular schedule had been stopped in open country, its express car stripped and its passengers rifled, while the crew stood helpless. The company already knew the Pinkerton agency well from earlier investigations. Alan Pinkerton had traced embezzled express funds in the East and smashed the Reno gang after their attacks on Ohio and Mississippi trains. In the Gads Hill case, Adams Express and Railroad officers agreed that they faced a new breed of robber whose name stirred sympathy in parts of Missouri and hatred in others. They wanted that gang broken, and they asked Pinkerton to take the job. By the time the Gads Hill train rolled into the company records, the name of Jesse James had been tied to robberies and killings since the late 1860s. Clay County bank raids, a blood-stained day at Gallatin, and the derailment and robbery of a Rock Island train near Adair, Iowa, had all carried his shadow. Iowa bankers had already hired the Pinkerton agency after a bank holdup at Corydon in June 1871, which led to an early confrontation between Robert Pinkerton and members of the gang at a farm in Missouri. That clash ended with the outlaws slipping away through timber after a brief exchange of fire. Gads Hill was something else. It was not just a single bank or courthouse, but a moving symbol of post-war commerce robbed in broad daylight by men who treated the act as a political message and a stage. Allen gathered his senior staff in Chicago and laid out what he knew. The gang's core came from former Confederate bushwhackers who had ridden with William Quantrill and William Anderson. Their families still lived in Clay County, Jackson County, and surrounding rural townships where resentment of Union militia remained sharp. Sheriffs and judges in those counties faced not only the danger of confronting hardened men, but also the anger of neighbors who saw Frank and Jesse James as local boys fighting old enemies. Pinkerton told his sons that this case would need more than a quick foray and a handful of arrests. It would require steady pressure in a countryside where many citizens would think twice before helping any outsider, especially someone from Chicago. The first move was to put an experienced operative on the ground near the James home country. Joseph Witcher took that assignment. He was a veteran detective, used to solitary work and to walking into places where his agency's name carried little weight. In late winter 1874, he traveled quietly to Missouri and began moving around Clay County, talking just enough to learn who went where, which roads the James brothers might use, and where their relatives' farms lay. The countryside rolled in low hills and hollowed lanes with timber stretches that could conceal men and horses within a short ride of any road. Farm families knew who belonged and who did not. Word that a stranger was asking persistent questions could travel quickly from one kitchen table to the next. Witcher walked and rode those roads under assumed names, but he did not have the luxury of a large support team or safe houses. Within a short time, his presence reached men who watched for just such visitors. Around the first half of March, farmers found his body on a rural road in Jackson County. His horse stood nearby. The corpse showed gunshot wounds and signs that he had been pulled from the saddle and finished at close range. The killers took nothing of value. They left him in the open as a message. When the news came back to Chicago, Allen read it with a tight jaw. A man he had known for years as a careful operative had been hunted down in the same country where the gang's supporters lived, and had been left without even the pretense of a robbery gone wrong. The agency's answer was to send more men, not fewer, but to change the way they moved. Two seasoned operatives, John Boyle and Lewis Lull, were assigned to go after the Youngers, whose names appeared beside the James brothers in reports from Gad's Hill and earlier robberies. They traveled undercover as buyers scouting cattle in western Missouri, a role that explained their questions about land, stock, and neighbors. To give them a legal arm, Jackson County Deputy Sheriff Edwin Daniels joined the party. Together they followed rumors into St. Clair County toward the vicinity of Monongahela Springs, a sparsely settled area of timber creeks and scattered farms where the Younger family had kin. On 17th March 1874, the three lawmen rode along a narrow road near Monongahela Springs. The track ran between brush on both sides. Late in the day, they met two riders coming the other way, John and Jim Younger. The four men stopped within speaking distance. The Youngers asked where the strangers were headed and why. Boyle and Lull kept to their cover story, saying they were after cattle. The talk grew tense. In that part of Missouri, ex-guerrillas and their friends suspected any unknown man who carried good horses and quality pistols. The moment stretched while each side weighed the other. Then hands moved for gun butts. The first shots came at close range. Daniels took a round that dropped him out of the saddle dead. Lull fired and hit John Younger in the neck and head, mortally wounding him. But not before Younger's fire slammed into Lull's body. Horses screamed and tried to break away as more bullets tore through brush. Boyle and Jim Younger fought clear, each thinking the other killed or captured. When local men reached the scene, they found Daniels dead, John Younger dying on the ground, and Lull badly hurt. Taken to shelter, Lull lived long enough to give a detailed account at a coroner's inquest, naming the Youngers and describing the fight blow by blow before he died several days later. Newspapers carried the story of a detective and a deputy ambushed on a Missouri back road, and in death Lull gave Pinkerton's agency a clear, sworn record of the encounter. Witcher's murder and the Monongahela fight triggered anger well beyond the agency. In Jefferson City, Governor Silas Woodson faced questions about why such men still rode free. The Gad's Hill robbery had been held up in the press as a direct insult to the state as well as to the railroad and express company. Now the gang and its circle had killed one Pinkerton detective, wounded another fatally, and shot a deputy who had ridden in the open with legal authority. Woodson responded by offering a reward of $2,000 for the Iron Mountain robbers, far beyond the sums usually posted for ordinary criminals, and by pushing the legislature to create a secret fund of $10,000 for use in hunting the James Younger gang. The money allowed state agents to hire informers, pay for travel, and work with private detectives behind the scenes. In rural Missouri, the effect was different. Families who had sons in Jesse James's wartime company or who had seen Union militia burn their barns did not forget the past. They read Western editors who printed Jesse's letters branding him a persecuted, former Confederate, They listened to neighbors who had heard that the gang spared working men at Gad's Hill and returned watches to veterans. For them, the death of a lawman who came from outside the state did not weigh as heavily as the next tax bill. That split between city and country, and between Union and former Confederate sympathies, complicated every move the Pinkertons made. The same fact that led railroad men to hire the agency, that its detectives answered to corporate offices instead of local factions, made parts of the countryside see those detectives as hired enforcers for distant interests. Even so, Allen would not drop the case. Reports from field men and from Missouri contacts pointed again and again to the James family farm near Kearney, in Clay County, as a fixed point in the gang's shifting movements. Frank and Jesse came and went from that log house, which stood on farm ground worked by their stepfather, Dr. Reuben Samuel, and their mother, Zerelda. Travelers along the nearby road saw horsemen visit at odd hours. In town, some citizens whispered that anyone who wanted to find Jesse James should watch that place. Others warned that whoever approached it with hostile intent would never leave alive. Among those who gave information to Pinkerton's people was a neighbor named Daniel Askew, a Union veteran who lived close enough to see traffic on the lane and who shared the agency's desire to bring the gang down. Through late 1874, Allen's sons Robert and William gathered what their operatives could provide from Clay and Jackson counties. The picture that formed showed an outlaw band able to move in small groups, supported by relatives and sympathizers who would not speak openly. It also showed that county officers either could not or would not mount the kind of direct assault on the James homestead that might catch the brothers unaware. Allen made a decision he had rarely made in other cases. Instead of waiting for the gang to surface at a bank or on a train, he would strike at their base. To do that, he prepared a detachment of agents who would travel west with an incendiary device designed to flush the outlaws out of the house at night so they could be taken in the open. On the night of 25th January 1875, a small group of Pinkerton men approached the James Samuel farmhouse under cover of darkness and winter trees. Accounts differ in small details, but they agree on the core facts. The agents moved up the slope toward the house, which showed light from within. Inside, the family sat near the fireplace. Zerelda, Dr. Samuel, and the younger children were in the main room. Frank and Jesse were not there. Whether they had left earlier that evening or that day, they were absent at the one moment when the plan turned lethal. One of the agents threw a heavy iron object filled with combustible material toward the house. It passed through a window or an open space and landed near the hearth, where it rolled into the fire. The blast that followed shattered more than glass. The explosion tore through the room, spraying hot fragments and igniting materials around the fireplace. Zerelda's right forearm was mangled. It would be amputated at the elbow before the night ended. Her young son, Archie Samuel, still a child, suffered devastating injuries and died soon afterward. Blood, smoke, and splinters filled the space where a family had been sitting moments before. In the confusion, whatever chance the agents had of seizing an armed outlaw vanished. The house became a place of screams and improvised medical care, not a target for arrest. The Pinkerton party withdrew into the dark, leaving behind a wrecked room, a dead boy, and a woman whose injuries would mark her for the rest of her life. Clay County woke to the news with fury. Neighbors saw the injuries, helped bury Archie, and heard Zerelda curse the men who had brought iron and fire into her home. News traveled fast along telegraph lines and through regional papers. Editors who had once described the James brothers as simple bandits now found themselves writing about an attack in which private detectives hired by corporations had maimed a woman and killed a child without capturing their intended quarry. Governors and legislators who had quietly supported hard measures against the gang heard from citizens who wanted to know how far the state would allow private forces to go on Missouri soil. The attack changed the way Jesse James was talked about in many places. In Clay County and beyond, people who had never met him but who had resented federal troops and radical politicians now framed him as a son whose household had been assaulted by outside men with money behind them. Handbills and conversations in saloons linked the dead Witcher, the Monongahela Springs fight, and the Kearney explosion in a single bitter chain, with each side blaming the other. To the Pinkertons, the deaths of their agents and the maiming of their quarry's family were part of a harsh war with ruthless criminals. To many Missourians, the James farm raid looked like proof that the detectives cared more for express money and Eastern opinion than for lives along the old guerrilla ground. On 12th of April 1875, another shot in that conflict sounded near the Samuel place. Daniel Askew, the neighbor who had spoken with Pinkerton men and who was suspected in the community of cooperating with them, stepped outside his home. Gunfire struck him down. He died near his well. No court ever convicted any person for the killing, but most people in the area understood it as retribution for his role in aiding the detectives. With Askew dead, the last local man who had publicly aligned himself with the agency in that neighborhood was gone, and the price of helping the Pinkertons in Clay County stood plain for everyone to see. From Chicago, Allen read the reports of Archie's burial and Askew's death and saw that the campaign as he had conducted it had reached a point where each new move cost the agency more in reputation than it gained in results. His men had been killed on Missouri roads. Their attempt to strike directly at the James home had given the gang new sympathy and had not produced a single capture. A neighbor who had cooperated with them now lay in the ground. He remained convinced that the James Younger gang deserved to be broken, but he also understood that the next steps would have to come from state authorities and from other structures of law. During 1875, he quietly withdrew his firm from direct pursuit of the James brothers, turning the agency's main energy back to express work, industrial protection, and other railroad cases where his detectives could still claim clear successes. The war with the James Younger gang did not end in those months, but the front line shifted. Missouri's rewards and secret funds continued, and law officers in several states watched for the gang at banks, stages, and trains. For the Pinkertons themselves, the years from Gadd's Hill through the Kearney explosion stood as a grim lesson. Against a mobile band with deep local roots, armed followers, and political meaning for its supporters, corporate detectives who used the hard tools they had honed on railroads could inflict harm without gaining control. The deaths of Witcher, Lull, Daniels, Archie Samuel, and Daniel Askew marked the cost in human bodies and public trust of a collision between organized outlawry and a private agency that had grown strong enough to stand beside sheriffs and governors on the main stages of the post-war West. 18th September, 1877. Night pressed in on the little water stop at Big Springs in western Nebraska, as Union Pacific Train No. 4 rolled toward the tanks, its coach lamps making a short tunnel of light through the prairie dark. Inside the express car, messenger Charles Murray moved between his safe and his waybills, working through routine steps he had done on countless trips. Outside, in the low ground near the track, Sam Bass and 5 partners lay with rifles ready, watching the headlight grow until the rails trembled under their boots. The train slowed for water just as every crew on that division knew it would, and Bass's gang stepped out of the darkness and into the beam. The first move came at the telegraph office. Earlier that evening, one of the outlaws had walked into the small frame depot where operator John Barnhart tended his key, held him at gunpoint, and marched him away from the instrument. The gang cut the line, leaving the station isolated, then waited until the scheduled time when the eastbound gold train would arrive. When No. 4 braked for the tank, masked men swarmed it, climbing aboard with practiced movements that showed more preparation than impulse. Passengers felt the jolt and then heard orders shouted in flat, steady tones, not the ragged yelling of drunkards, but the commands of men who had argued through their plan and now followed it. In the express car, Murray found himself staring into the muzzles of at least 2 guns. He had been warned in company circulars that a time-lock safe could not be opened between its settings, no matter what an outlaw demanded, and he tried to explain that fact while steel prodded his ribs. The gang dragged him and a brakeman into the car, beat them with pistol butts, and threatened to blow the safe apart. When the door refused to move, frustration turned them to the rest of the cargo. They smashed open smaller wooden boxes one after another until the dull gleam of freshly minted double eagles shone in the lamplight. Those crates held $60,000 in new $20 gold pieces from the San Francisco Mint, shipped east under the assumption that a heavy safe and a quiet prairie night would be secure enough. The outlaws used grain sacks and whatever cloth they could find to shovel the coins inside. They cursed the stubborn time lock, but worked with method. Other gang members moved through the coaches, taking what they could from a handful of passengers, though the total from wallets and watches would never match the fortune in gold stacked on the express floor. The crew and travelers were ordered not to look too closely at the men behind the masks. The entire scene, from the moment the train stopped until the gang vanished into the dark, lasted only minutes. Yet for the railroad and the express company, it marked a sharp change. Train robbery had shifted from a rough grab at loose cash to a strike at the heart of long-distance commerce. Bass and his partners led their horses from the brush where they had been tied, and rode away from the dim station lamps into flat open country. They did not linger near the tracks. Somewhere on the prairie, under a large tree that gave a little cover from the skyline, the gang halted to divide the loot. 6 men, including Sam Bass and Joel Collins, worked by lantern to portion out the coin, each taking an equal share. The new mint pieces clinked into saddlebags heavy enough to drag on leather straps. Bass was a comparatively young man, thin-faced and narrow, but that night he rode like an equal among older, hardened associates who had drifted from cattle, freight work, and stagecoach robberies into a far larger crime. At dawn, the Union Pacific train reached a point where telegraph lines still worked and word of the robbery jolted along the wire. The gold shipment amount stunned company officials and bankers in eastern offices. Local law near Big Springs moved quickly as well. Sheriff Asa Bradley gathered a posse, and soldiers from a nearby post joined the chase, following tracks and scattered clues through rough country. Within days, separate detachments cornered some of the gang members. Collins and William Heffridge, riding with part of the loot, were killed during a confrontation near a place listed in reports as Buffalo Station. Another associate fell later in a fight near Mexican Missouri, carrying a smaller sum. Others vanished into the wide spaces between the plains and the timber, their identities never fully pinned down in official papers. Bass and his close companion Jack Davis slipped south, keeping out of the way of known trails and stage roads. They moved under the cover of ordinary travel, passing as cowhands or small traders when they had to appear in settlements. Underneath the seat of a wagon or wrapped in bedrolls heavy with coins lay Bass's share of the Big Springs take. He did not spend it all at once. In North Texas, he could pay his way in Denton County saloons without flashing spectacular wealth. Yet the steady availability of gold let him buy horses, weapons, and supplies without long stretches of honest work. In one version of his life told in contemporary pamphlets, he boasted that money had meaning only while a man breathed, a line that fit the way he used his share. By early 1878, Bass had assembled a new set of partners in Texas. Men such as Henry Underwood, Frank Jackson, and Seaborn Barnes drifted into his orbit, drawn by his calm manner and willingness to stand front rank in a gunfight. Stage lines north of Dallas began losing cash and mail sacks when masked riders stepped into the road with leveled shotguns. Those robberies brought in only modest sums, yet they signaled that the man from Big Springs had not retired. Bass and his gang were hiding in thickets and creek bottoms in Denton County and nearby areas, using small farmhouses and friendly saloons as places to rest and gather information on train schedules. Railroads had learned the cost of leaving valuable shipments unguarded. Since the 1850s, express companies and major lines had signed contracts with the Pinkerton National Detective Agency to investigate thefts and guard high-value shipments, and by the 1870s, the agency's methods for train robbery cases were well developed. When Bass and his new gang moved from stages to trains in Texas, railroad officials turned again to those detectives. Notices circulated among lawmen that a manhunt involving Pinkerton investigators, Texas Rangers, and United States Marshals had been authorized. In Texas newspapers and later folk memory, that combined effort would be called the Bass War. The first Texas train robbery tied firmly to Bass came on the Texas and Pacific Line near the small town of Allen. On a cold night in February 1878, the gang stopped a train, forced open the express car, and searched for strongboxes and envelopes. It was the first train robbery within Texas state lines, and it shook Dallas County residents who had heard earlier stories from Missouri and Nebraska, and now saw the same pattern reach their own depots. The gang escaped with a relatively small haul, yet the symbolic value of a train stopped under guns near a growing city alarmed both business leaders and state officials. Within weeks, another train was held up near Hutchins, south of Dallas, then others near Eagle Ford and Mesquite. In one spring stretch, Bass's riders robbed 2 stagecoaches and 4 trains within a circle of roughly 25 miles around Dallas. Each time, the bandits rode hard out of the immediate area, crossed creeks where running water could blur tracks, and faded into heavy cover. They rarely fired unless pressed, and they kept the robberies brisk to reduce exposure. These tactics made them hard to pin down, but every new incident increased pressure on authorities to answer with more than ordinary county pauses. Pinkerton detectives arrived along with additional rangers. Some came in on the same rails Bass had targeted, stepping down at Dallas and nearby stations with instructions to blend into the background. These men carried the experience of earlier railroad cases. They knew that country people along a line noticed unfamiliar saddles, stringy horses ridden hard at odd hours, and strangers buying supplies with gold coins rather than ragged paper. Following their usual approach, the detectives fanned out from depots, visiting section houses, farms, and small stores, interviewing anyone who might have seen riders slipping through at night. They noted every description of trails used near the robberies and sent those observations through their own report system. Texas Rangers brought a different kind of local authority. Under Major John B. Jones, the Frontier Battalion had already made its reputation on the plains, and a special company under Captain Junius Peak focused directly on Bass. Rangers rode where county sheriffs had limited reach, camped in the same brushy country the Outlaws favored, and built their own network of informants in Denton and neighboring communities. Pinkerton men and Rangers coordinated with railroad detectives and marshals, sharing information on suspected riders and hideouts. Telegraphs carried messages between Dallas, Austin, and points north as everyone tried to tighten the circle. The pressure reached deep into Bass's own circle through Jim Murphy, a Denton County man who had ridden with the gang. Murphy's father fell into the hands of law officers charged with aiding outlaws. Held in custody without access to a physician, the older man's health declined. Lawmen sent word that any chance of mercy or medical care depended on Jim Murphy meeting them. Under that strain, Murphy agreed to talk. He sat across from Rangers and other officers and step by step laid out Bass's routes, camps, and future intentions. The price for his cooperation was consideration for his family, and he carried that bargain back into the outlaw world while pretending nothing had changed. Murphy's information showed where Bass intended to strike next. The gang planned to move south toward Round Rock in Williamson County and rob a bank there. The town lay along the International and Great Northern Railroad, a place where money moved and where the outlaws believed local resistance might be manageable. Major Jones shifted rangers toward that region. Local law in Williamson County was warned that strangers on good horses with extra mounts would mean more than passing cowhands. Pinkerton men continued to track leads tied to the Dallas area robberies, but the immediate work of staging the trap in Round Rock fell to rangers and county officers. On 19th July 1878, Bass, Seaborn Barnes, Frank Jackson, and Jim Murphy rode into Round Rock. The town sat in the heat of a central Texas summer, with dust on the roadway and wagons moving between stores and the railway platform. The four men tethered their horses near a blacksmith shop and walked the short business district, buying tobacco and taking the measure of the place they intended to rob. Murphy, already secretly linked to the Rangers, watched for the moment when he could slip away and warn Jones that the gang had arrived. Deputy Sheriff A.W. Grimes of Williamson County noticed the strangers and their sidearms. Local ordinances required visitors to surrender or check weapons within town limits, and Grimes decided to enforce that rule. He approached the men near a store and told them to give up their guns. The confrontation turned deadly in seconds. One of the outlaws shot Grimes in the chest at close range. The deputy fell in the street, fatally wounded before he could draw. The sound of that first shot tore through Round Rock's ordinary business and turned the entire downtown into a killing ground. Rangers positioned nearby, alerted earlier by Murphy, heard the gunfire and moved toward it. In the running battle that followed, Barnes fired from behind cover and was hit and killed. Rangers George Harold and Richard Ware closed in and exchanged shots with Bass and Jackson. Bullets chipped brick, splintered fence rails, and sent townspeople scrambling for any doorway or wall that would stop lead. Bass tried to mount and escape, but somewhere between the first exchange and his attempt to break free, rounds struck him. Witnesses described him stumbling and struggling with his horse before he managed to ride out of town, bleeding and weaker with every yard. The fight in Round Rock was short, yet violent. When the shooting stopped, Deputy Grimes lay dead, Barnes's body lay in the dirt, and the surviving outlaws had scattered. Jackson rode free with Bass for a time, then they separated under cover of brush and ravines west of town. Rangers and local posses searched in the stifling heat, following reports from farmers and passers-by. Eventually, Deputy James Milton Tucker found a wounded man lying near a trail. According to those on the scene, the injured outlaw called out to the riders that passed close, identifying himself as Sam Bass, and giving up any remaining chance to slip away in silence. Bass was carried back to Round Rock, placed under guard, and given what medical attention the town could provide in that era. He lingered through the night into 21st July 1878, his 27th birthday, then died from the gunshot wounds. Questions about the location of any remaining Big Springs gold, the full list of those who had ridden with him, and the exact role of everyone who had fed him information or shelter remained unresolved. The gang as an organized force, however, was broken. Within a year, the train robberies that had shaken Dallas and the surrounding region stopped. For the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, the base pursuit marked one more entry in a growing list of Western cases tied to railroads and express companies. Agency leaders later grouped Sam Bass alongside other train robbers in public lectures and articles, using his story as another example of how private detectives and public lawmen could combine to close in on outlaw gangs. In Texas memory, people spoke more often of Rangers in connection with Round Rock, yet contemporary accounts made it clear that railroad-hired detectives, including Pinkerton men, had helped drive Bass into that final corner by turning a string of scattered crimes into a tightly focused manhunt. The result underlined a reality for outlaws who grew up dodging county sheriffs. Once the railroads and their detectives set themselves against a gang, escape routes on the frontier narrowed fast and tended to end in a street like the one in Round Rock, stained with blood and watched by men who had orders to bring the robbers down. 22nd July, 1878. The telegraph from Texas came into the Chicago office just after dawn, its strip of paper curling from the brass sounder on the wall of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency's main room. A clerk with ink on his cuffs lifted the tape, read the words about Sam Bass dying of his wounds at Round Rock, then crossed the floor to the long line of pigeonholed files. He pulled a thick envelope marked in black ink for the express robberies that had troubled the Texas lines and slipped the telegram into the front, where other reports on the same gang already sat in order, from the first rumor of a plot to the last sighting before the fight in the street. The case room around him did not look like a frontier story. It had the still air of a counting house. Heavy wooden cabinets filled the walls from floor to ceiling. Each drawer carried a stenciled label divided first by state and territory, then by type of offense, and finally by name. Inside, stiff paper jackets held reports written in the same tight hand, everyone laid out on a standard printed form. At the top ran the case number and client. Below that, in smaller letters, came the timing and location of each event, the list of suspects, and the known associates. At the bottom, a wide blank space waited for the final disposition, whether arrest, death, or escape. Misspellings and personal flourishes had been beaten out of the files by Alan Pinkerton's rules. If a detective wrote that a man was tall or short, the report came back. The writer was expected to give a measurement in feet and inches along with a note on posture and gait. The same insistence on detail governed the physical descriptions that built the agency's growing system of identification. Every suspect with any record went into a separate index where height, build, eye color, scars, birthmarks, and mannerisms were written down in the same sequence every time. A thief in Missouri who favored cheap cigarillos and carried a scar over the left eyebrow appeared in the file that way. When the same man turned up later in Kansas with a new name and another theft, the combination of traits matched. In a decade when many sheriffs still kept their notes in pocketbooks or on loose scraps stuffed into a desk drawer, Pinkerton clerks sat at long tables and copied information onto cards that could be sorted and cross-referenced. For ranchers, bankers, and railroad men in the West, that quiet room full of paper turned into a weapon that could reach much farther than any local badge. Down the hall, in a separate chamber with blinds drawn against the morning glare, another collection sat in heavy leather-bound albums. These were the faces. By the 1870s, the agency had gathered thousands of photographs into what it called the Rogues Gallery, a set of pages where each image showed a front view and a profile. Under each photograph, the clerks wrote the subject's name, every known alias, the list of prior offenses, and a summary of the methods used in past crimes. There were burglars who preferred skylights, safe men who favored black powder over nitroglycerin, and train robbers who always cut telegraph wires before they went to work. Pinkerton photographers and cooperating jail wardens supplied new pictures whenever a suspect was arrested. The albums grew until they filled a locked cabinet of their own, with a separate index that linked faces to case numbers in the files next door. The Rogues Gallery did not stay in Chicago. Smaller selections, mounted on stout cardboard, were prepared for clients who paid an annual fee for private protection. The American Bankers Association received albums of faces and descriptions that its member banks kept behind their counters, so a teller in a rough Nevada boomtown could study the same criminal portraits that a cashier in New York would see. Railroad and express companies subscribed to the same service through their headquarters. Agents at depots along the Union Pacific and the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe hung the cards along the walls of back offices where only employees went, and conductors carried pocket-sized pamphlets with line drawings based on the photographs. When a stranger bought a ticket with nervous hands or loitered near the baggage car, an experienced man compared his features with the familiar faces in the book. From those same photographs and descriptions, the agency printed wanted circulars by the thousands. Each sheet carried a block of text specifying the crime, the reward, and the names of the detectives handling the case, along with a likeness when any photograph was available. Clerks folded stacks of these sheets, slipped them into envelopes marked for county sheriffs, town marshals, railroad special agents, and trusted informants in saloons and gambling halls. The mail sacks moved west in the same baggage cars that held the money and payrolls the Pinkertons had been hired to protect. In distant places where there was no regular police force, the arrival of a new bundle of circulars meant that the local justice of the peace and the livery stable owner now knew the faces and habits of men who had never set foot in their territories before. The results showed up in the case files as a change in the way investigations began. In earlier years, alarms had usually come from a single town, where a sheriff faced a robbery he did not understand and telegraphed Chicago for help. By the late 1870s and early 1880s, the first reports often came from a brief line in a circular returned with a scrawled note. A marshal in western Kansas would write that a man matching description number such and such had been seen drinking with cowboys along the Arkansas River. A station agent in Colorado would add that the same man had inquired at night about schedules for a gold shipment. A Pinkerton coordinator in Chicago pinned those fragments to a master board and ordered an operative already in the region to have a look, often before the gang had taken action on any particular train or bank. The men sent out on those errands lived in the same physical world as the outlaws they hunted, but the agency's discipline changed how they moved through it. A detective nursing a glass of beer in a Dodge City saloon listened for the way a hand of cards went quiet when a certain name came up. His orders told him never to boast, never to accept a dare to show his marksmanship, never to flash cash unless it came straight from the rolls supplied by the office. Each evening he wrote a report in a cramped hotel room or a shed behind the livery, stating who he had met, what had been said, and which names matched entries in the rogues gallery. When his sheets reached Chicago, a clerk checked every spelling and date before attaching them to the appropriate case jacket. The system was blunt in its demands and exact in its expectations, and a man who did not obey it could not remain in the field. Alan Pinkerton watched this machinery tighten in the last years of his life. His name still stood at the bottom of the letterhead, but more of the daily work went through his sons, William and Robert, who had grown up around the agency and now handled much of its correspondence. One of Alan's preoccupations in those years was the creation of a single master register of criminals, a project that would draw together the scattered case files and photographs from Chicago and New York into one central record. He spoke often of the need to bring order to a landscape in which telegraph lines and railroads had given criminals a national reach, while law officers remained trapped in county boundaries. The case clerks felt his hand in the constant revisions to their forms, as new boxes appeared for handwriting samples, aliases in other languages, and notations on whether a suspect had family in Canada or Mexico. In the summer of 1884, Alan walked unsteadily through the Chicago office, leaning on a cane as he checked the progress of that register. Old injuries and recent illness had taken strength from his frame, yet he still paused to question operatives about their reports and to issue instructions about priorities. When he died that July, the agency did not stop for a day. The file room continued to receive telegrams and reports. Agents remained in the field on assignments that bore his authorization. Within weeks, the stationery changed to place William and Robert's names in the principal position, and the routine of the office adjusted to a world in which decisions came from two desks instead of one. William brought a direct connection to the Western work. From his base, he built a clientele that centered on railroads, mining companies, and investors who kept their capital tied up in cattle, silver, and grain across the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains. He traveled the lines in person, sitting with superintendents and treasurers in depots at places like Denver, Cheyenne, and Trinidad, explaining how the agency's records could identify repeat offenders long before they approached the local vault. He did not promise that there would be no robberies. He promised that when such crimes occurred, the men behind them would not remain unknown for long. As the client list grew, so did the Western administrative structure. In the middle of the 1880s, the agency opened a formal office in Denver to serve as headquarters for work west of the Missouri River. At first, a long-time operative ran the branch with considerable independence, acting as a broker between powerful mine owners, railroad directors, and the detectives in the field. When reports reached William and Robert in the late 1880s that the Denver office was mishandling funds and cases, they sent James McParland to investigate. McParland had already made his name by infiltrating violent coal field organizations in Pennsylvania, and the brothers trusted his judgment. He arrived in Denver quietly, examined the books, read the back files, and interviewed clients. His findings led to the dismissal of the branch management and most of the staff. The agency retained only McParland and another experienced operative, Charles Siringo, as the core of a rebuilt Western division. From that point, the Denver office served as both an operational base and a relay point for information flowing between scattered detectives and the main files in Chicago and New York. McParland demanded that every man in the field wire his movements and observations to Denver in code, rather than waiting to send longhand reports by mail alone. Clerks in the Colorado office decoded those messages, compared them against the rogues gallery selections they kept on hand, and then forwarded clean summaries and any new photographs to Chicago. A description of a robber who had held up a train near Laramie with a particular style of mask, and a favorite curse word might arrive in Denver in the morning and be on Allen's old index cards in Chicago before nightfall. The same rigor applied to lesser-known gangs that troubled remote lines and wagon roads. Case files from the later 1880s show folders marked for outfits such as the Frank McCoy Gang, and the group led by A.E. Minor, known as Old Bill. Their jackets contain typed or carefully handwritten narratives of robberies, accounts of attempts to sell stolen bonds and cash, witness sketches of faces and voices, and photographs clipped from studio portraits or taken in jail yards. Each robbery report included a section comparing the latest job with earlier crimes, noting whether the height estimates of the participants matched, whether the same phrases were used in threats, and whether any of the men smoked or chewed the same brand of tobacco as suspects already recorded in the rogues gallery. The growing sophistication of the records changed how local lawmen saw the Pinkertons. In many Western communities, there had been distrust of outside detectives, especially when agency men worked for railroads or mine owners during strikes. Yet sheriffs and marshals also understood that their own tools were limited. Cooperation grew in practical ways. A deputy in Arizona might send a scorched scrap of a note found near a blown safe to Denver, knowing that Pinkerton clerks could sometimes match the handwriting to a past extortion letter for a bank in another state. A marshal on the High Plains could telegraph a list of unusual horse brands seen at a camp near a robbery, and within days receive a reply listing known thieves who favored those mounts in other territories. By the end of the 1880s, the system reached into places where no Pinkerton operative stood in person. Small banks in Nebraska and Wyoming received regular bulletins listing new suspects and recent crimes, along with instructions to compare customers and visitors against the enclosed descriptions. County attorneys in Idaho and Montana asked for copies of statements taken by Pinkerton men in earlier cases so that prosecutors could confront defendants with their own words from previous trials. In an age before any government bureau maintained a national criminal listing, The thick ledgers and photograph albums in the private offices at Chicago, New York, and Denver formed the closest thing to a shared memory of outlaws that existed on the continent. The impact on traveling criminals showed in patterns that no single town could have traced. Men who once drifted from Missouri to Kansas to Texas, working the same swindles under different names, found that local officials greeted them with questions about earlier crimes committed hundreds of miles away. Train robbers who left behind a distinctive knot in a cut telegraph wire or a habit of shooting with the left hand found those details recorded and passed along. A man could still outrun a single sheriff on a fast horse. He could not outrun a file cabinet that sat quietly in an office thousands of miles away and yet could put his history on a marshal's desk in a distant place. As the decade closed, the accumulated material in those cabinets reached a size that even the founders could not have imagined at the start. Case numbers climbed into ranges that filled pages of indexes. Photographs packed the rogues' gallery volumes until new bindings had to be ordered. When leaders of the National Bureau of Criminal Identification in Chicago needed a base of photographs and descriptive records for the centralized index they opened in the late 1890s, William Pinkerton agreed to share the agency's collection. By that time, the habits of filing, cross-indexing, and cooperating with scattered law officers had already turned the Pinkerton system into a Western dragnet that lived in files, correspondence, and photographs, rather than in any single town. It depended on paper and ink and on the resolve of men who believed that once a criminal's name and likeness entered their records, he could run, but he could not become unknown again. 6 July 1892. Gray light lay over the Monongahela River as two long barges lashed behind a tug moved toward the dark bulk of the Homestead Steel Works outside Pittsburgh, each packed with armed men from the Pinkerton National Detective Agency who had been hired to break a strike and open the mill for their corporate client. Inside the plant, furnaces, rolling tables, and cranes stood idle. Outside the river fence, thousands of locked-out steelworkers and their families held the ground, determined that no private guards would cross their line to bring in non-union labor under the guns of strangers. The conflict building to that morning had begun months earlier in offices far from the smoke and heat of the furnaces. Andrew Carnegie's company dominated steel production, and the Homestead Mill in Pennsylvania's Monongahela Valley was one of its most important plants. Skilled men at Homestead belonged to the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, a union that had won a strong contract in the 1880s but faced new demands as the company pushed to cut labor costs and run more hours at lower pay. In early 1892, Henry Clay Frick, acting as chairman while Carnegie remained overseas, announced that the company would no longer recognize the union on most of the mill's departments and posted a sharp wage reduction that the men refused. Frick prepared for a fight. He ordered a tall fence topped with barbed wire erected around the plant and had rifle ports cut in strategic spots, turning the works into what local people started calling Fort Frick. He drew up lists of workers to be locked out and made arrangements to bring in non-union men to run the mill if the old crew refused the new terms. Because he expected fierce resistance, he sought private guards who would not answer to local sheriffs and who would come in organized units. In April, he turned to the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, signing a contract for hundreds of armed watchmen to protect Carnegie Steel property, guard incoming replacements, and stand ready to enter the plant should regular law prove unwilling or unable to do so. Steel workers at Homestead understood what that meant. Many had seen or heard of the agency's earlier work in coal and railroad strikes. As the June contract deadline approached, they tightened their own organization. When talks finally collapsed at the end of June, the company posted notice of a lockout and shut down the furnaces. On 1st July, workers took control of the mill and surrounding streets. They established round-the-clock pickets, set up lookouts all along the riverbank, and used union committees to keep order in town while the official sheriff of Allegheny County made only token efforts to assert his authority at the gates. In the first days of the shutdown, Frick tried to clear the plant using local law. The sheriff brought deputies to the mill, read proclamations, and asked the workers to let him through. They refused. Deputies who did not live in Homestead showed little appetite for forcing their way past thousands of angry steel workers, many of them armed with rifles or shotguns brought from their homes. Frick concluded that the only way to retake the mill was to bring in the Pinkertons by water, under cover of night, so that they could land inside the company's own property without having to cross picket lines on the public streets. Pinkerton directors in New York and Chicago accepted the assignment. The men chosen for Homestead were not the quiet undercover operatives who had once shadowed Outlaws on Western rail lines. They were contract guards hired from cities such as Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia, many of them recruited from lodging houses with promises of steady pay. They assembled at the Davis Island Dam on the Ohio River a few miles below Pittsburgh. There, the agency issued Winchester rifles, ammunition, and badges stamped with the words, "Watchman, Carnegie Company, Limited." The guards were told that their duty was to secure a plant threatened by a violent mob and to protect company property. Late on the night of 5th July, the guards filed aboard 2 large barges that had been outfitted with rough sleeping space and small firing ports. A tugboat took them in tow and started upriver, first on the Ohio and then into the Monongahela. On the dark water, with only a few lamps showing on each craft, the men below decks tried to rest on hard planks, while supervisors walked the narrow passages between them reviewing instructions. Any thought that the force would arrive unnoticed faded, as the flotilla passed neighborhoods where steelworkers and their families stood watch along the shore. Word flashed into Homestead that barges carrying armed Pinkertons were on the way. By the time the tug pushed the barges toward the company wharf at Homestead around 4 in the morning, a crowd had already gathered on the riverbank. Men who had worked the furnaces and mills crowded the site, joined by wives, children, and residents from nearby towns. Some carried rifles, others held clubs, pistols, or tools. Women brought buckets of water and tended small first aid kits. At the first attempt by the Pinkerton guards to throw out a gangplank and come ashore, shots rang out from both sides. Witnesses later disagreed on who pulled a trigger first, but within minutes the ground and the riverbank were trading live fire. The barges grounded against the bank and the guards tried to climb the slippery slope in loose formation, firing upward as they moved. Strikers shot back from behind piles of lumber and from improvised positions near the fence. Some bullets struck men on the barges, others hit workers packed along the shore. Early in the fight, at least one Pinkerton guard fell dead on the gangplank, rolling back into the water, while a steel worker near the front of the crowd dropped with a bullet through his chest. Panic threatened to sweep both sides. Pinkerton officers ordered their men back onto the barges and told them to fire only when they had clear targets. Strike leaders yelled for discipline along the bank and tried to keep the crowd from charging straight into the guns. The battle lasted for hours. As the morning wore on, the guards remained trapped on the barges, unable to force a landing but protected by the steel and wood of their floating shelters. The strikers tried to break that stalemate with improvised weapons. They soaked a flatboat in oil, set it alight, and pushed it toward the barges, hoping to set them on fire. The burning craft drifted close but did not fully ignite the Pinkerton positions before it was beaten away. Later, they rolled a rail car loaded with oil barrels down a slope toward the riverfront, sparks flying as metal wheels clattered over track, only to see it stop short and burn out at the water's edge. Some men used small charges of dynamite against the barges, damaging planking but failing to sink them. Gunfire took a toll on both sides. Steelworkers and their supporters fired from positions along the bank and from hills overlooking the landing. Guards shot back from firing ports cut in the roofs and sides of the barges. smoke from repeating rifles mixed with the thicker smoke of burning timber. By midday, several Pinkerton men lay dead or gravely wounded inside the cramped boats, and multiple workers had been killed along the shore, including men struck by stray fire and accidents with makeshift artillery. Doctors and volunteers worked over injured strikers in nearby buildings while wounded guards lay on the barges with only the care their companions could give them. News of the fighting spread quickly beyond Homestead. Telegraph operators sent urgent messages to Pittsburgh and beyond, and newspaper editors rushed correspondents to the scene. Crowds gathered in downtown streets to read bulletins posted outside offices and to argue over who had provoked the bloodshed. At the mill, however, the men on the ground had little time for wider opinion. Through the afternoon, more armed workers from other plants in the valley arrived to reinforce the Homestead men. Some estimates placed the number of strikers and supporters in the thousands by midday, while roughly 300 Pinkerton guards remained confined to the barges, exhausted, low on water, and surrounded. Shortly after mid-afternoon, both sides began to look for a way out. Many of the steelworkers believed they had already made their point by preventing the guards from taking the plant. Others feared that continuing to fire on trapped men would invite even harsher retaliation. On the barges, Pinkerton supervisors counted their dead and wounded and knew they could not hold indefinitely. Sometime after 4 o'clock, the guards raised white flags and asked for terms. Union leaders and strike committee members pushed through the crowd to reach the river's edge and negotiate the surrender. The agreement that followed called for the guards to stack their weapons on the barges, submit to arrest, and be escorted through town to trains that would carry them away from Homestead. In theory, the steelworkers would disarm their enemies, hand them over, and avoid further killing. In practice, when the Pinkertons stepped off the barges and began their march between dense ranks of people, passions that had been building for days broke loose. Men and women struck the guards with fists, clubs, and pieces of scrap as they passed. Some guards were knocked down and kicked on the ground before strike leaders and a few calmer citizens managed to restore some order and push the column forward. By the time the wounded and shaken survivors reached trains under escort, their uniforms were torn and stained, and the name Pinkerton had become a bitter word in households far from Homestead. That same day, state officials began planning their response. Under pressure from Frick and other business leaders, the governor of Pennsylvania ordered the state militia into the town. Within days, long lines of National Guard troops marched into Homestead with artillery and camp equipment, set up positions around the steel works, and reasserted control over the property. The soldiers cleared remaining pickets from the gates and allowed Carnegie Steel to bring in non-union workers under armed protection. The lockout and strike dragged on through the summer, but with the mill running under guard and many arrested strikers facing charges, the union's ability to resist collapsed. The Homestead conflict took a terrible human toll. At least 3 Pinkerton guards and a number of steelworkers and townspeople died outright in the fight and its immediate aftermath, and dozens on both sides suffered gunshot wounds or other serious injuries. Families in Homestead buried husbands and sons. Families in eastern cities received bodies shipped home from Pennsylvania, or letters describing injuries treated in distant hospitals. The immediate struggle in one mill town had become a national event, played out in political speeches and editorials that argued over the right of workers to organize, the power of large corporations, and the role of private security forces in violent labor disputes. For the Pinkerton Agency, which had built its reputation on hunting train robbers and protecting express shipments, Homestead marked a sharp turn in public perception. The company had been providing guards and strike duty services in coal, iron, and railroad disputes for years, but none of those engagements had produced a pitched battle on the scale of the fight along the Monongahela that summer. Photographs and drawings of barges full of armed guards facing off against workers and their families. fixed in the public mind the image of a private army for hire, one that seemed willing to use rifles against citizens in the interest of management. Politicians in Washington took notice. Members of Congress debated the broader question of whether private detective outfits and guard companies should be allowed to act as auxiliary forces in labor conflicts that could spill over into riots and bloodshed. Some legislators argued that if industrialists could hire hundreds of armed men to hold territory against workers, then the balance of power in any dispute tilted sharply toward capital. Others defended the right of companies to protect their investments when local law officers could not or would not act. The images from Homestead, where 300 private guards had sailed through the night to confront locked-out workers, made those arguments more urgent. Concern in Congress produced direct legislation. In August 1892, as part of a Civil Appropriations Act, lawmakers approved a clause that barred the federal government from hiring anyone employed by the Pinkerton Detective Agency or similar organizations. The following year, on 3 March 1893, Congress made that prohibition permanent, embedding it in federal law in language that still stated plainly that no individual employed by the Pinkerton Detective Agency or by an agency like it could be hired in any government service. The measure did not prevent private companies or state governments from using Pinkerton guards or detectives, but it signaled that the national government would keep a formal distance from organizations seen as selling armed forces to the highest bidder. The political and public reaction had real effects on how the agency presented itself and chose its assignments. Pinkerton managers began to emphasize investigative work, such as tracking express robbers and embezzlers in their public statements, and spoke less often of strike duty. In some cases, they turned down contracts that would have placed large numbers of their guards in direct confrontation with organized workers, calculating that the damage to the firm's name would outweigh the immediate fee. Railroads and industrial clients still hired Pinkerton men to protect property. But after Homestead, many did so more quietly, aware that the open use of private guards could ignite protest and calls for official intervention. Out on western lines and in mining camps, outlaws and property criminals continued to face determined pursuit from detectives who drew on the same case files and rogues galleries that had already shaped earlier manhunts. Yet inside cities and mill towns, workers and reformers increasingly spoke of the Pinkertons in another way, as symbols of a private coercive power that stood outside democratic control. The events at Homestead in July 1892, followed by the anti-Pinkerton language written into law the next spring, showed that while robbers might still find their paths narrowed by private detectives beyond the reach of local sheriffs, those same detectives would now operate under a new kind of scrutiny from legislators and citizens who had seen what happened when a private guard force stood on one side of a locked gate and an organized workforce stood on the other. 2nd June, 1899. Dawn had not yet cleared the high ridges near Wilcox, Wyoming, when Union Pacific's overland flyer rolled eastward toward a wooden bridge across a small creek, its headlight throwing a narrow path over rails that gleamed in the early light. At the bridge, men from Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch waited with horses tied in the brush, their coats padded against the chill and their hands already blackened by handling dynamite. As the engine reached the span, a signal lantern swung in the gloom, and the engineer saw that part of the trestle had been damaged. He cut steam and brought the train to a stop, unaware that the same men who had weakened the bridge now moved up out of the broken country with rifles in their hands. The gang split their work. Some covered the locomotive crew with guns, ordering the engineer and fireman down from the cab. Others ran along the consist toward the express car, where the safe from the railway company sat under the eyes of the messenger. The air filled with shouted commands and the clank of couplers as the outlaws forced the crew to uncouple the express and baggage cars, then draw them forward a short distance. Once they had the car they wanted isolated, they ordered the messenger out and set charges of dynamite against the door. The first blast buckled metal and sprayed splinters. The second tore the car so badly that pieces of wood and iron rained down along the right-of-way. Somewhere in that eruption, a fireman named W.R. Jones took fatal wounds that ended his life within hours, a reminder that explosives at close quarters did not distinguish between railroad men and robbers. Smoke drifted over the wrecked express car while members of the Wild Bunch scrambled inside. They found currency, registered mail, and other valuables, hastily stuffing what they could into saddlebags and grain sacks. At the coaches farther back, frightened passengers watched armed silhouettes move against the pale sky. Some accounts later insisted that the gang ignored travelers who did not look wealthy, as at earlier robberies. But the main focus that morning was clearly the express cargo. Once they seized what looked worth carrying, the outlaws mounted and rode away from the tracks, picking a route that led into country cut with draws, river bends, and broken ground where no posse on fresh horses could easily see them. Within hours, the Wilcox robbery set telegraph keys rattling between small Wyoming depots and larger offices in Cheyenne, Denver, and Omaha. Reports from the crew described several men, masked or with bandanas pulled up, speaking in calm tones and handling their weapons as if they had used them often. Local Converse County Sheriff Josiah Hazen read those descriptions and matched them with names he already knew, including Butch Cassidy, Kid Curry, Elsie Lay, and George Curry, men who had been linked to earlier holdups and who drifted through the ranching and outlaw ground between Wyoming and Utah. He gathered a posse and set out along the rough trails that left the Wilcox Bridge site, hoping to catch the robbers still close to their crime. The pursuit showed how hard it was to close with such a gang on their own terms. At points along the route, the posse saw where the outlaws had switched horses, taking fresh mounts from relay strings hidden earlier in the sage. Where the trail dropped into creeks, tracks vanished in shallow flowing water. Somewhere along one of those waterways, Kid Curry and George Curry chose to stand rather than run. In the clash that followed, Hazen went down under their fire, killed while doing what many local sheriffs had tried to do in those years, pushing hard against men whose lives were spent with a saddle under them and a revolver near at hand. The outlaws escaped on foot by wading downstream, leaving their own horses behind and throwing off pursuit in the folds of country they knew well. Union Pacific officials and the managers of the express company did not intend to let the matter end with one dead sheriff and an exploded car. The Wilcox robbery embarrassed them in two ways. It damaged their equipment and cost them cash, and it showed the public that even a well-established transcontinental line could be stopped in remote country by a compact group of men using dynamite and steady nerve. They turned to the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, which already held contracts for past railroad work, and asked for a sustained investigation. Case files in Chicago and Denver began to fill with telegrams, interviews, and field reports as the Wilcox folder grew thicker week by week. Pinkerton men studied every surviving detail from the scene. They looked at fragments of the wrecked express car, examined the pattern of the blast, and took note of how the gang had separated the consist. They read the descriptions of height, build, and voice tone provided by train crew members, then compared those details against existing entries in the rogues gallery. Several of the features pointed toward men already known, including Harvey Logan, better known as Kid Curry, whose record for sudden violence stood out even among hard cases. To deepen the hunt, the agency dispatched operatives such as Charlie Siringo, whose work involved moving quietly through saloons, ranches, and outlaw haunts under assumed names while writing regular reports back to the office. The investigators did not work alone. Union Pacific put its own bandit hunters into the field, and stock detectives like Tom Horn gathered information about which riders moved through remote ranch country with new cash and fine horses. Better use of telegraph lines and rewards meant that lawmen in distant counties heard quickly when someone passed bad banknotes or flashed unusual gold pieces. Each time, a Pinkerton clerk checked serial numbers and descriptions against lists tied to Wilcox. When any match appeared, an operative or a local officer followed up, sometimes arriving at a remote cabin or line camp only hours after the suspects had left. The pursuit did not end in a single clash. Instead, the space for casual travel steadily shrank. Despite the new pressure, Cassidy's outfit continued to hit major targets. On 29 August 1900, the gang robbed another Union Pacific train near Tipton, Wyoming, once again using dynamite to open the express car. The blast blew the sides from the car as it Wilcox, scattering debris along the grade. The gang gathered what they could under the light of lanterns and moon, then vanished into the same wide country that had shielded them before. Railroad officials claimed publicly that the takings were small, but other accounts valued the haul much higher. Whatever the exact figure, the fact remained that a second train on the same line had been robbed within little more than a year, and that the same circle of outlaws appeared responsible. The Tipton attack ended a different story that had been forming quietly behind the scenes. In the months before that robbery, Butch Cassidy had explored the idea of an amnesty, with Western governors and railroad executives trying to trade a promise of good behavior for leniency on earlier charges. Union Pacific's chairman E. H. Harriman even considered whether it might serve his interest to have Cassidy leave train work alone. Any such talk died the night the safe door flew from the express car at Tipton. After that, whatever thin chance existed that the Wild Bunch's leader might settle under his own name disappeared. 3 weeks after Tipton, 3 mounted men walked into the First National Bank of Winnemucca, Nevada, just before midday on 19 September 1900. In a few minutes, they forced the cashier and his assistants at gunpoint to hand over sacks of gold coin and currency, then backed out of the building and into the street. Witnesses saw them mount and ride away at a controlled pace, turning out of town toward rougher country beyond the nearby hills. Reports out of Nevada listed a loss of more than $30,000 in cash and gold, an amount that shook local businessmen and thrilled writers who followed outlaw news. The bank belonged to the American Bankers Association's network, and the association had long used Pinkerton's services to investigate major robberies and track professional criminals. Within days, Pinkerton investigators arrived in Nevada, interviewing witnesses and following the trail of hoofprints and campfires into the desert and mountain country north and east of town. They compared the timing and style of the job with earlier bank raids credited to the Wild Bunch. There, as at Wilcox and Tipton, the men had moved with calm control, avoided needless shots in the street, and left town with a clear escape plan. Later Pinkerton assessments and modern regional histories identify Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and Will Carver, Winnemucca trio, though, as in many such cases, no court ever tried them under those names for that specific crime. As the Winnemucca investigation unfolded, another piece of the case fell unexpectedly into Pinkerton hands far to the southeast. In Fort Worth, Texas, a group of outlaws who had shared in the Wyoming and Nevada work decided that a thriving cattle town made a good place to spend some of their money. They rented rooms, bought new clothes, and posed in local saloons as successful cowmen and investors. Sometime in November 1900, 5 of them walked up the stairs to the studio of photographer John Swartz on Houston Street and sat for a formal portrait in suits, ties, and bowler hats. Swartz arranged them carefully, set his camera, and exposed a plate that caught Harry Longabaugh, known as the Sundance Kid, Will Carver, Ben Kilpatrick, Harvey Logan, and Robert Parker, better known as Butch Cassidy, seated and standing together with their hands resting on knees or chair backs. The finished photograph went into Swartz's display where passing customers could admire his work. One day, a law officer in Fort Worth recognized at least some of the faces in the picture from older descriptions and from wanted circulars. He obtained a copy and sent it on to Pinkerton offices. There the image was mounted in the rogues gallery and printed on new wanted posters that gave names, aliases, and physical details under the group of 5 men. Those posters went out to banks, railroads, and sheriffs across the West. For the first time, a single clear image showed the central Wild Bunch figures from head to waist, dressed not as dusty riders but as men of means who could travel in cities and railroad towns. The Fort Worth photograph changed the chase. Until then, many reports about the Wild Bunch had been uncertain on who exactly belonged to which robbery. Now, when a bank teller examined a customer with a particular jawline and mustache, he could compare that face to a printed image pinned behind the counter. Telegraphs from scattered towns began to use the same names and aliases. When a marshal in one state described a suspicious rider in his own words, a Pinkerton clerk in Chicago or Denver could hold the Fort Worth image against earlier photographs and confirm that the man in question was the same person already wanted elsewhere. Pressure on the Wild Bunch increased from other directions as well. After the Wilcox and Tipton holdups, Union Pacific and other lines put more guards on trains, improved safes, and coordinated more closely with detectives and state officers. In July 1901, members of the gang robbed a Great Northern train near Wagner, Montana, taking tens of thousands in banknotes. During the long pursuit that followed, Bill Carver died under posse fire, and Ben Kilpatrick was arrested months later in St. Louis, with part of the loot still traceable. Pinkerton reports in those cases marched steadily from robbery, scene to arrest and conviction, showing that the combination of rapid communication, standardized descriptions, and persistent fieldwork could bring even far-flung band members into custody. For Cassidy and Longabaugh, the shrinking room for movement in the United States led to a drastic choice. In early 1901, they traveled east under assumed names, boarding a ship in New York with Etta Place and sailing for Buenos Aires. In agency records, they became subjects in a foreign section, people of interest whose letters and rumored sightings came from a different continent. Pinkerton investigators tracked their passage through ship manifests and money transfers, then followed them onto land as they established themselves on a ranch at Cholila, in the foothills of the Andes. On that spread, the three built a log house, bought cattle and horses, and tried to pass as hard-working settlers. Letters later cited by writers describe a small household of 3 people managing several hundred cattle, more than 1,000 sheep, and dozens of horses. The Pinkertons were not fooled by the new names. Through informants and cooperating consular officials, they learned of James Ryan and other aliases tied to the ranch and matched those to Robert Parker and Harry Longabaugh. By early 1903, an agency operative named Frank DeMaio stood in Buenos Aires reading bank records that showed an English-speaking client depositing large sums at the London and River Plate Bank. Under a name the files in Chicago already recognized as a cover. Even with that knowledge, arrest was not simple. International law, local politics, and the sheer distance from reliable backup made any move against the Cholila Ranch risky. Patagonia's winters were harsh, and the men the Pinkertons sought were still armed and experienced in escape. The agency sent warnings to regional authorities and banks, urging caution if suspicious Americans tried to negotiate large drafts or seek work as guards or freighters. At the same time, detectives in North and South America monitored rumors of new robberies, asking whether each fresh job bore the signature of an American gang living under new skies. By 1904, the Wild Bunch as an organized force in the United States had scattered. Some members lay in graves in Wyoming, Utah, and Montana. Others served long sentences in territorial and federal prisons. A few drifted back into ranch work or small jobs under assumed names. Cassidy and the Sundance Kid still rode in South America, their exact trail faint even to those who hunted them. But the ground they had once known in Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Texas no longer offered them easy shelter. In the Pinkerton cabinets, the files on Wilcox, Tipton, Winnemucca, and Wagner now sat thick with affidavits, photographs, and circulars, a complete record of a long-distance contest between mobile train and bank robbers and a private detective agency that had followed them from isolated bridges in Wyoming to streets in Fort Worth and bank counters in Buenos Aires. 14th May, 1906. Midday wind pushed over the grasslands near Douglas Lake in British Columbia while three tired men bent over a cooking fire, their rifles propped within arm's reach and their saddled horses ground-tied in the open. The oldest man, gray-bearded and narrow-shouldered under a dark coat, answered to the name George Edwards in that country, but court records and detective files on two borders already carried his true name, Ezra Allen Bill Miner. He had walked away from a string of stagecoach robberies and prison terms in California, then shifted to trains when the age of the stage line faded. Now, after a muddled payroll holdup on a Canadian Pacific line near Duck Station only days earlier, he sat on his heels stirring coffee while mounted police, local ranch hands, and provincial officers closed a ring around the grove where he and his partners had stopped to eat. The robbery that brought Miner into that camp had taken place on the 8th May 1906 when three armed men stopped a Canadian Pacific train near Monte Creek and forced the crew to detach the cars they believed carried company cash. They chose the wrong car, blew open a safe that held only registered mail and a small payroll, and left with little more than scattered currency, some papers, and a bottle of kidney pills taken from a shelf. There were no killed passengers and no destroyed bridge, only frightened crewmen and a damaged mail car, yet the insult cut deep. The railway wanted any surviving train robber from the old years found and broken. Telegrams and written descriptions went out from Kamloops to New Westminster and across the border to agencies and express companies that had chased Miner through earlier decades. Pinkerton case files in the United States already held a thick record of his aliases, prison numbers, and methods from his time as a stage and train robber in the West, and those records now marked him for Canadian officers who heard his name and history from railroad security men who dealt regularly with the Chicago office. By the time the posse's rifles were leveled on that cook fire near Douglas Lake, Miner and his two companions had been hunted nearly a week through canyons and over ridges by mounted constables and local cowboys following the sign of shod horses and camp ashes. When uniformed men stepped from the trees and shouted commands, Miner stood up slowly, hands empty, still using the respectable name George Edwards that he had carried as a rancher and neighbor near Princeton. His younger partner, Tom Shorty Dunn, tried to pull a pistol and took a bullet in the leg for his trouble. Another man, Louis Colquhoun, froze as rifles covered his chest. Miner never drew a gun. There was no last stand as newspapers liked to print. The gun smoke drifted away over the brush while officers disarmed the three men and walked them out between two files of riders toward Kamloops. At the local jail, the older prisoner answered questions in a calm voice, insisting he was an honest prospector who had chosen the wrong trail. The officers who had studied telegraphed descriptions and circulars shook their heads. The tattoos, the age, the worn, careful hands, and the stories of earlier prison terms all matched the record for Bill Miner that Express Company detectives and the Pinkerton agency had compiled through years of robberies farther south. Miner's trial in Kamloops that summer drew crowded galleries, newspaper sketches, and long daily columns from reporters who had read American accounts of his earlier career. The courtroom air felt close and hot. Railway officials sat together on one bench watching each witness walk to the stand. Evidence from the Monte Creek job, including the recovered bottle of kidney pills, tied the old man at the defense table to the fumbling train holdup that had netted only a handful of dollars. Local residents who had known him as George Edwards listened as the record of his past stagecoach robberies and prison sentences in California came into the open through sworn testimony and documents transmitted from American courts. When the jury returned with a conviction and the judge pronounced a life sentence in the British Columbia Penitentiary at New Westminster, Miner reportedly told the court that no prison could hold him. Officials sent him under guard to the stone-walled institution on the Fraser River, locking him in among long-term prisoners whose crimes belonged to a newer century. Inside that penitentiary, the gray-haired train robber from the earlier frontier years became a source of fascination for guards and fellow inmates. Warders watched him closely, but his behavior remained disciplined, shaped by many earlier prison terms. He worked in assigned shops, spoke politely, and studied the routines and weak points of the institution. Outside, railroads and express companies updated their files one more time. Pinkerton staff responsible for criminal records added his Canadian conviction and sentence to the existing Miner dossier, noting that an aging bandit once associated with stage lines in the far west had now turned to Canadian trains and would spend the rest of his life under confinement unless illness or age took him first. The file entry did not last long as a closing note. On the 8th August 1907, Miner vanished from inside New Westminster after a carefully executed escape, slipping past bars and walls that had held hundreds of other men. The details of that escape became part of the same Pinkerton and Express Company correspondence that had tracked him across earlier decades, but the essential fact remained simple. A man who had robbed coaches in California and trains in British Columbia still refused to end his life behind walls. In the same year that Miner escaped, William Allen Pinkerton stood before an audience of police officials at the Jamestown Exposition in Virginia and delivered an address that summed up more than 4 decades of confrontations with train robbers. His printed talk, titled Train Robberies, Train Robbers, and the Hold-Up Men, described how the nature of those crimes had changed since the earliest post-war attacks on express cars. He spoke as head of a private detective agency, but the men in his audience were chiefs and senior officers from municipal forces and state departments who now shared many of the same methods. Pinkerton described how the earliest gangs had exploited unprotected safes and thin train crews, and how the response over time included burglar-resistant safes bolted to car floors, armed guards hired by express companies, shadow detectives placed on trains as passengers, and coordinated pursuit that drew on telegraph reports from stations along a line. He discussed individual cases without romantic language, presenting them as examples of how persistent investigators could break gangs, identify accomplices, and recover property when local juries and frightened sheriffs had failed. One section of William Pinkerton's address focused on the final generations of train robbers whose careers linked the older frontier era to the modern world of professional criminal investigation. He spoke of gangs that moved between territories and states, no longer confined to a single county and no longer restrained by local reputations. He pointed to men who specialized in robbing railroad mail and express shipments without killing train crews, and to others who were quick to gun down law officers or citizens who stood in their way. His address described how some of the last independent bandits from the earlier period, including men such as Tom Blackjack Ketchum in New Mexico and Bill Miner with his long run of stage and train jobs, had ended their careers either on the gallows, under gunfire, or inside penitentiaries far from the rough trails they had once ridden. The message to his audience carried a clear practical point rather than nostalgia. Centralized records, strong safes, armed guards, and cooperative pursuit made it harder every year for isolated outlaws to rely on the gaps between counties or the protection of intimidated local officials. Outside that conference hall, the western lands where Allen Pinkerton and his sons had once ridden behind outlaws already looked different from the broken plains and timbered river valleys of earlier decades. New states had replaced territories, courthouses had replaced crude frontier lockups, and railroad companies had organized their own professional police forces. Pinkerton operatives still took contracts from express companies, banks, and large railroads, but their work often involved quiet observation, the cultivation of informants, and the tracing of money instruments rather than week-long horseback chases. In many towns, sheriffs and city police now kept their own rogues galleries with photographs and measurements copied from Pinkerton files. Telegraph offices that had once carried frantic warnings of holdups now carried routine notices, and rising telephone lines connected chiefs and detectives across states. When a robbery occurred, it no longer unfolded in a legal vacuum. Company investigators, public police, and private operatives shared leads so that a man who stepped off a westbound train in one state might find officers waiting in the next, because someone hundreds of miles away had wired information ahead. The change reached beyond individual cases. By the first decade of the new century, the United States Justice Department had created a Bureau of Investigation that began to draw on patterns long familiar to Pinkerton men, including centralized filing of case reports, coordinated use of informants, and systematic comparison of handwriting, photographs, and identifying marks. In speeches and internal reports, observers described how private detectives had helped pioneer methods for criminal identification that government agencies then adopted and expanded through federal funding and national jurisdiction. Pinkerton's long-standing practice of assembling case files, clipping newspaper stories, preserving mugshots, and indexing personal details by name, crime and physical description gave state and federal agencies a template for what centralized record-keeping could achieve. That system changed the balance between outlaws and lawmen in remote regions. An outlaw could still cross a county line or a state boundary, but his earlier arrests and associates now followed on paper and in photographs. In the West, train robberies did not end overnight. Men still tried to stop express and mail trains in remote places as the 19-teens and 1920s opened. Yet each attempt carried new risks because railroads now maintained heavy safes that often destroyed their contents when robbers used dynamite, and because express guards carried repeating rifles and revolvers and had orders to use them. Special agents employed directly by railroads patrolled yards and rode aboard high-value runs. Pinkerton operatives supported these efforts by investigating suspicious employees, tracing stolen negotiable bonds and currency, and following paper trails through banks and merchants in distant cities. Their detectives took trains rather than horses for long legs of a pursuit, and they used telephones to coordinate with local police rather than relying only on personal observation and slow letter writing. The most notorious example of a late-era train robbery handled under these conditions came in the summer of 1924, far from any frontier canyon. On the night of the 12th June, a mail train of the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul line approached a junction near Reno, Illinois, carrying registered mail sacks, currency, and negotiable securities. The Newton brothers from Texas, now hardened bank and train robbers with a network of accomplices, had assembled a complex plan using a corrupt postal inspector, 4 stolen automobiles, and a team that included a safe man and lookouts. They stopped the train, used tear gas on mail clerks, and removed sacks to waiting cars on a nearby road. The haul eventually reached into the millions in currency and valuables, making it the largest rail heist in American history to that point. Unlike earlier frontier robberies, this crime took place within easy reach of Chicago and in a region thick with law officers, newspapers, and telegraph and telephone lines. The investigation that followed showed how far the world of criminal pursuit had moved since the days when Alan Pinkerton had trailed gangs across lonely plains. United States postal inspectors took the lead under federal authority because mail shipments had been attacked. Railroad police and local officers in Illinois and Texas traced vehicles, spent money, and contacts. Pinkerton detectives entered the case on behalf of affected express and insurance interests. using their commercial relationships and record systems to track negotiable bonds and securities that appeared in financial markets after the robbery. Within months, coordinated questioning, informant work, and financial tracing identified the Newton brothers, Brent Glasscock, and the corrupt Inspector William Fahey. Arrests followed in different states as officers picked up suspects who had believed distance and new names would protect them. The investigation did not rest on a single detective riding into an outlaw hideout. It depended on linked offices, shared records, and sustained cooperative work, with Pinkerton men functioning as one important part of a wider chain. By the late 1920s, public discussions of train robbery already used phrases such as last great holdup when describing cases like the Rondeau heist or the earlier Doutremont attack on a mail train in Oregon. The men who sat in Pinkerton offices in Chicago, Denver, New York, and other cities no longer expected to spend most of their time on Western bandit gangs. Their assignments increasingly involved industrial espionage cases, insurance investigations, plant security, and the tracking of urban thieves and swindlers. The older files on frontier outlaws remained in cabinets and on shelves, but newer drawers filled with union organizers, professional burglars, confidence men, and corporate fraud. Former rail detectives and shadow men who had followed horse tracks along creek beds learned to read bank ledgers and shipping manifests instead. Their experience with long-term surveillance, undercover identities, and careful evidence gathering remained valuable. But the stage on which they used those skills had shifted from canyon country and cattle towns to city streets and factory gates. For the western regions where the Pinkerton agency had once chased the Reno gang, the Burrow brothers, Butch Cassidy's riders, and other outlaws, the change was visible in smaller ways. Armed express guards became a standard part of train crews. Railroad companies installed burglar-resistant safes whose weight and construction forced robbers to use enough explosive to destroy contents and car walls, cutting the appeal of the crime itself. Local sheriff's departments and state ranger forces built on lessons learned in the decades when they had relied on Pinkerton help, improving their own investigative capacity. Many of the methods first used against Western outlaws, such as undercover work in saloons and stockyards, the cultivation of informants in outlaw-friendly communities, and the systematic cross-checking of names, aliases, and physical features became routine in state and federal agencies. The FBI's early efforts at assembling a national criminal identification system and crime laboratory in the first half of the 20th century echoed practices that Pinkerton operatives had used since the mid-19th century, now scaled up with government backing and nationwide authority. The outlaws who came of age in the years after Miner's capture and the Newton gang's fall tended to move through towns and highways rather than open trails, and they faced a landscape of telephones, radios, and organized police that did not exist during the first wave of train robbery. They might still find corrupt officials or sympathetic neighbors. But when a federal inspector, a railroad police captain, or a Pinkerton investigator opened an old file drawer, a web of prior arrests, associates, and sightings could reach across several states. Men who had once believed they could outrun local lawmen on fresh horses now found that bank deposits, registered bonds, train tickets, and hotel registers carried their names farther and faster than any posse. For the Pinkerton agency, this shift meant fewer weeks on the trail and more hours in offices and train compartments. But the organization's central identity remained rooted in patient, methodical pursuit that did not stop at county lines. By the time the last of the Newton brothers died in old age and train robbery had become a subject for nostalgic film scripts and magazine features, the old western frontier that had given rise to horseback gangs had long since disappeared. What remained from those years were files, photographs, and methods. Pinkerton records, stored in archives and occasionally mined by historians and law officers, traced the careers of men from the Reno brothers to Bill Miner and from lesser-known stage thieves to widely known bank robbers. Those records documented how a private detective agency hired by railroads, banks, and express companies had helped close a period when local juries, frightened sheriffs, and isolated towns had struggled to deal with roving criminal bands. The same practices that allowed Pinkerton operatives to follow outlaws from one railroad division to another, to assemble witness statements from scattered communities and to piece together aliases into a single identity, later helped shape how government agencies approached nationwide crime. The Western outlaws of the 19th century wanted distance, sympathetic settlements, and gaps in jurisdiction to keep the law off their backs. Local lawmen often lacked the time, reach, or political backing to pursue them far beyond a county line. The hard lesson those outlaws faced over the next half-century was that Pinkerton detectives and their successors working with railroads, express companies, and later federal agencies could cross those lines and hold on to a name long after a gang had scattered. From the campfire at Douglas Lake, where Bill Miner laid down his cup in the shadow of mounted police carbines, to the mail car outside Rondout, where Newton gang members dragged heavy bags toward waiting cars and then found themselves traced and arrested, the pattern stayed the same. Local law might be outwitted or outgunned in a single town, but an organized system of investigators who kept records, shared information, and refused to drop a trail meant that the men who tried to live by robbing trains and banks could not shake pursuit forever. In that sense, the Old West ended not only when fences and town streets replaced wide, unfenced ranges, but when the idea of a persistent detective presence, built in large part by the Pinkerton Agency, made the frontier itself a harder place for outlaws to disappear.